In the vast expanse of the Russian Empire during the late 19th century, the winds of change began to stir. It was a time of profound social, political, and cultural unrest. Amid the echoes of revolution and transformation, one figure would rise to reshape not only his homeland but the entire course of history. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Born in 1870, Lenin's journey was marked by a relentless commitment to ideas that would forever alter the world. He was a man of thought and action, navigating a tumultuous era of upheaval with a vision that challenged the foundations of the Tsarist regime. As the 20th century unfolded, Lenin would become a central figure in the Russian Revolution, setting the stage for the rise of the Soviet Union and the global spread of Marxist ideology. This documentary takes you through the entire life of Vladimir Lenin, from his early years in the quiet town of Simbirsk to the revolutionary halls of St. Petersburg, and through the turbulent days that followed his rise to power. It is a story of intellect, struggle, and a vision for a new world, one shaped by both ideals and harsh realities. As you listen to this story unfold, let the gentle pace of the narrative guide you through Lenin's life. May the details of his journey offer a moment of calm reflection, gently enveloping you in the history that shaped the world we know today. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing where you're listening from, but only when it feels right to do so. Let this story of Vladimir Lenin accompany you through the night, as we take you on a quiet, unhurried journey through his life. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born on April 22, 1870, in the town of Simbirsk, located along the Volga River in the heart of Russia. At the time of his birth, the Russian Empire was ruled by Tsar Alexander II, a monarch who had recently enacted significant reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Despite these reforms, Russia remained an empire in which the majority of the population lived under strict autocratic rule, and the aristocracy held much of the power. It was a world far removed from the one that Lenin would help bring into being, one marked by social equality and the dismantling of old hierarchies. Lenin's family background was a source of considerable influence throughout his life. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, was a well-respected civil servant who held the position of a district inspector of schools. A man with a passion for education, Ilya instilled in his children the importance of learning and intellectual curiosity. Though a middle-class family by Russian standards, the Ulyanovs were not wealthy. They were part of a class that was caught between the nobility and the growing merchant class. Yet, despite their modest means, they valued education highly, and this would come to play a crucial role in Vladimir's later development. Lenin's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was a woman of deep intellect, but she was also deeply affected by the tragedies that befell her family. Born into a noble family of German descent, Maria was well educated and had a strong interest in literature and the sciences. Though her family had faced a sharp decline in fortune due to the collapse of the serf system and other economic difficulties, she remained devoted to her children's education. Her influence was perhaps the most formative, as she was the one who encouraged Vladimir's independent thinking and intellectual pursuits. Vladimir was the second of 6 children, though only 3 of his siblings survived infancy. His older brother Alexander was especially influential in his early years. A brilliant student, Alexander was an early role model for Vladimir. However, it was Alexander's tragic death that would play a crucial role in shaping Lenin's political journey. In 1887, Alexander was arrested for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The authorities executed him, and this event left a profound mark on Vladimir. The loss of his brother led Lenin to question the nature of the Russian state and the system of government that allowed such an injustice to occur. The death of his brother was a defining moment for Lenin. It was not merely the death of a family member, but a catalyst for the transformation of Vladimir from a young intellectual into a revolutionary thinker. In his later writings, Lenin would often speak of the necessity of political action, and the personal loss of Alexander became an emotional touchstone in his ideological development. It was through this grief that Lenin's commitment to revolution began to take its most serious form, as he came to believe that the existing social order was one that only bred injustice and oppression. Lenin's early life in Simbirsk was marked by both privilege and tragedy. The family's home was modest but comfortable, located on the banks of the Volga River. Here, the young Vladimir would spend much of his time reading, an activity that would shape him for the rest of his life. Although his school days were largely uneventful, they provided him with a strong foundation in the classics and the sciences. He excelled in his studies, particularly in mathematics and history, subjects that would later influence his political thinking. The town of Simbirsk, though not large, was a place of contrasts. The slow-moving river contrasted with the rapid societal changes taking place within Russia. It was a period in which new ideas were beginning to emerge. Despite the oppressive nature of Tsarist Russia, this intellectual ferment would eventually reach Lenin, whose inquisitive nature led him to seek out new ideas beyond the confines of his family's home. As Lenin grew older, his thoughts began to turn toward the political climate of his time. Russia in the late 19th century was a land of sharp divisions. The ruling Tsarist regime continued to impose strict controls on society, while the working classes and peasants languished in poverty. The gap between the rich and the poor was wide, and the system seemed to offer little hope for change. It was against this backdrop of social inequality that Lenin began to develop his revolutionary ideas, though at this point he was still a young man, learning the basic tenets of Marxism that would eventually shape his worldview. The influence of Marxist theory, however, did not come immediately. Lenin was first exposed to radical ideas through his brother's involvement with student groups and the intellectual circles that flourished in Russian universities at the time. These groups, many of them inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, advocated for the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the establishment of a society based on equality and the common ownership of property. It was within this context that Lenin's intellectual development began to take a sharp turn. Though initially skeptical, Lenin eventually became deeply committed to the ideals of Marxism. By the time he was in his late teens, Lenin had developed a deep understanding of the inequities of the Russian system. He had also come to understand that intellectual inquiry alone would not bring about change. It was action, revolutionary action, that would be necessary to topple the existing order. These realizations laid the groundwork for the young man's political ambitions, which would soon take him far beyond the quiet confines of Simbirsk. The family's experience, marked by both privilege and tragedy, set the stage for Lenin's transformation from a curious intellectual into a committed revolutionary. His early years were marked by a combination of personal loss, intellectual exploration, and exposure to the social inequalities of his time. These formative experiences would shape the man he would become, a leader determined to change the world. His early days in Simbirsk were only the beginning of a journey that would take him from small-town Russia to the heart of a revolutionary movement that would change the course of history forever. Vladimir Lenin's early childhood, spent in the small town of Simbirsk, was a formative period that shaped much of his later political thinking and revolutionary fervour. As a young boy, he was surrounded by the influences of his family, particularly his mother, Maria, whose intellectual curiosity and devotion to her children's education left a lasting impression. Though his family was by no means wealthy, the Ulyanovs valued education and culture, which provided young Vladimir with opportunities that many of his peers did not have. His early years were marked by a deep sense of loss. In 1886, when Lenin was just 16 years old, his father passed away unexpectedly. Ilya Ulyanov's death had a profound impact on the young Vladimir, who had looked up to his father as a role model. The loss of his father meant that Lenin had to mature quickly and take on more responsibility within the family. It was during this period that Vladimir began to cultivate a sense of independence and a determination to succeed. This loss also shaped his understanding of authority in the state, feelings that would eventually develop into revolutionary zeal. The young Lenin's education was deeply influenced by his family's commitment to intellectual pursuits. He excelled in his studies, particularly in the subjects of history and literature. His teachers recognized his brilliance, and he was often praised for his intellectual curiosity. However, it was not just academic excellence that defined his early years. Lenin's childhood was also marked by the formation of his character. He was an independent thinker, often questioning authority and the social norms of the time. His exposure to radical ideas, particularly those of the growing socialist movement, began during these formative years. At the age of 16, Lenin enrolled at Kazan University, where he began to experience the political turbulence that would shape his life. The university was a hotbed of radical thought, and it was here that Lenin first came into contact with Marxist ideas. In 1887, while still a student, Lenin's older brother Alexander, who had been involved in radical political activities, was arrested and executed for his role in a failed assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III. This tragic event marked a turning point in Lenin's life and had a profound impact on his political development. The death of his brother Alexander left a void in Lenin's life, but it also propelled him into action. Alexander's execution served as a stark reminder to Vladimir of the brutal reality of the Tsarist regime, and it motivated him to dedicate himself to the cause of revolution. The personal loss was a catalyst for his intellectual awakening and his decision to pursue radical politics. Lenin's grief, however, was not merely personal. It became the foundation for his revolutionary ideals. He believed that the Tsarist regime which had condemned his brother to death was corrupt and oppressive, and that it must be overthrown. At Kazan University, Lenin quickly became involved in student activism. The university environment was ripe with political ferment, and the students were becoming increasingly disillusioned with the autocratic rule of Tsar Alexander III. Lenin, already influenced by his family's commitment to intellectualism and his personal loss, began to advocate for revolutionary change. It was during his time at Kazan that Lenin's political beliefs solidified, and he began to focus on the writings of Karl Marx. He was particularly drawn to Marx's critique of capitalism and his vision of a workers' revolution that would overthrow the capitalist system and replace it with a socialist order. However, Lenin's time at Kazan University was short-lived. In 1887, he was arrested for his involvement in a student protest. The authorities accused him of participating in a revolutionary conspiracy, and Lenin was expelled from the university. He was sent into exile in the remote province of Kostroma, a punishment that would have far-reaching consequences for his future. During his time in exile, Lenin continued to study Marxist theory, which deepened his commitment to the revolutionary cause. His time in exile also allowed him to reflect on the political climate of Russia and the need for change. Lenin believed that the working class needed to be organized, and that the Tsarist regime could only be overthrown through revolution. His exposure to the writings of Marx and Engels, as well as his own experiences in exile, solidified his belief in the necessity of armed struggle to achieve social change. The experience of exile also gave Lenin the time and space to develop his own political ideas. He began to refine his understanding of Marxism and to develop his own theories on how to achieve a socialist revolution. Lenin became convinced that the working class, or proletariat, must lead the revolution. However, he also believed that a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries would be needed to guide the workers and provide leadership. This idea of a vanguard party would become a cornerstone of Lenin's political philosophy, and would play a crucial role in his leadership of the Russian Revolution. Lenin's time in exile was a period of intellectual growth and political development. He immersed himself in Marxist literature and began to formulate his own ideas about the revolution. It was during this time that Lenin developed the determination to dedicate his life to the cause of revolution. He also began to develop a sense of urgency about the need for change. Lenin saw the Tsarist regime as a deeply oppressive and unjust system that needed to be overthrown, and he became increasingly convinced that the working class was the key to bringing about this change. The political climate in Russia was changing, and Lenin's early experiences, both personal and intellectual, had a profound influence on his revolutionary thinking. By the time he had completed his exile and returned to the political arena, Lenin had become a committed revolutionary. His childhood and formative years had shaped his character, his beliefs, and his vision for the future of Russia. They had also set him on the path to become one of the most influential figures in the history of the 20th century. After his time in exile, Vladimir Lenin returned to St. Petersburg in the early 1890s, where his education and political thinking began to take clearer form. By this time, he had already experienced the profound impact of losing his father and his brother Alexander. His exile had deepened his intellectual curiosity and strengthened his resolve to bring about revolutionary change. As he resumed his education, Lenin's academic and political journey became more focused, aligning his thoughts with the radical Marxist ideas that would ultimately shape his revolutionary path. Lenin's return to St. Petersburg marked the beginning of his serious commitment to political activity. The city, then the capital of the Russian Empire, was a hotbed of intellectual activity and political unrest. It was here that Lenin first became deeply involved in Marxism, a movement that was gaining momentum in Russia, particularly among the intellectuals and the working class. Lenin's exposure to Marxist theory came through the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, whose critiques of capitalism resonated strongly with his own sense of injustice. At this time, Lenin was studying law at the University of St. Petersburg. He had initially pursued law as a practical field that would allow him to have a steady career, but his academic interests increasingly gravitated toward the study of history, economics, and philosophy. It was through his studies of these subjects that Lenin began to develop a broader understanding of the social and economic systems that governed Russia and the world. His immersion in Marxism at this time was a pivotal moment in Lenin's development. Marx's theory of class struggle and the idea of a workers' revolution, in which the proletariat would overthrow the capitalist system, aligned with Lenin's own frustrations with the political and social system in Russia. The Marxist idea that history was shaped by the conflict between different social classes resonated deeply with Lenin's belief that the Russian autocracy was an inherently unjust system that needed to be dismantled. In St. Petersburg, Lenin was also introduced to other revolutionaries and activists who shared his ideals. The intellectual circles in the city were buzzing with revolutionary fervour, and Lenin became actively involved in these discussions. It was through these connections that Lenin first began to articulate his vision of a socialist future, one in which the working class would take control of the means of production and eliminate the exploitation inherent in capitalism. During this period, Lenin's life choices took a decisive turn. He began to see himself not merely as an academic or an intellectual, but as someone whose purpose was to organize the masses and lead them in a revolution. His education, which had initially been about securing a respectable career in law, became secondary to his political ambitions. Lenin now viewed his education as a tool to advance his revolutionary goals. He immersed himself in the works of Marx, Engels, and other socialist thinkers, refining his ideas and developing a clearer vision of how to achieve the revolution he believed in. In 1893, Lenin joined the Union for the Liberation of the Working Class, a Marxist organization that aimed to unite the workers and intellectuals in their struggle against the Tsarist government. This organization was one of the first steps in Lenin's transition from an academic theorist to an active political revolutionary. It was in this context that Lenin began to develop his revolutionary strategy, focusing on the need for a disciplined vanguard party to lead the working class to power. This idea would later become one of the cornerstones of Leninist thought. Lenin's decision to devote himself fully to the cause of revolution had profound consequences for his personal life. In 1895, he was arrested once again for his political activities. He had been involved in distributing revolutionary literature and organizing workers, and the authorities saw him as a threat to the status quo. Lenin was exiled to Siberia once more, but this time the period of exile would prove to be even more important for his ideological development. The time he spent in exile allowed him to read and reflect deeply on Marxist theory, and it was during this period that he began to write extensively. While in Siberia, Lenin worked on developing his theoretical ideas, particularly regarding the nature of the revolutionary movement. He wrote articles that explored the relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry, the role of intellectuals in revolutionary movements, and the structure of the party that would lead the revolution. These writings laid the intellectual groundwork for Lenin's later contributions to Marxist theory, and provided the foundation for his leadership of the Russian Revolution. Lenin's time in Siberia also allowed him to reflect on the challenges of organizing a revolution in Russia, where the working class was small and the peasantry was largely illiterate and politically disengaged. This was a crucial period in Lenin's life, as he began to develop the idea of a vanguard party, a disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries that would lead the workers and peasants to power. Lenin believed that only through such a party could the revolution succeed. This idea would later become central to his approach to revolution and governance. After his exile ended in 1900, Lenin moved to Europe, where he continued to build connections with other Marxist revolutionaries. In Switzerland, he became involved with the Iskra newspaper, a publication that aimed to unite Marxist groups across Russia and Europe. Lenin's involvement with Iskra marked a new phase in his political career, as he worked to unite the various factions of the Russian socialist movement and establish a more organized, centralized revolutionary movement. His writings during this period became more focused on the practical aspects of revolution, and he began to develop the strategies that would later guide the Bolshevik Party to victory. Lenin's early education and life choices were pivotal in shaping his revolutionary path. His time in St. Petersburg, his exposure to Marxism, and his involvement in revolutionary activities led him to make the decision to dedicate his life to the cause of revolution. His experiences in exile and his writings during this period helped to refine his ideas and solidify his commitment to the Marxist cause. Lenin's early years were marked by the formation of his revolutionary ideology, which would guide him throughout his life and shape the future of Russia and the world. As Lenin's understanding of Marxism deepened, his commitment to the revolution became unwavering. His life choices, both academic and political, had set him on a path from which there would be no turning back. Lenin was now a revolutionary, fully dedicated to the cause of overthrowing the Tsarist regime and building a new socialist society. His intellectual development and political decisions during these years were critical in shaping the leader he would become and the revolutionary movement he would lead. By the turn of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin had firmly established himself within the revolutionary movement. But it was at this point in his life that a critical decision would shape the future of his career and the course of Russian history. Lenin's early years has been defined by intellectual development, political activism, and exile. Yet it was the culmination of these experiences that led to a decisive moment. The moment when Lenin fully embraced the need for organized revolution and the idea of a vanguard party to lead the working class. During the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, Lenin began to see more clearly the challenges that Russia faced and the form that revolutionary change would need to take. He had already been exposed to the ideas of Marxism, but as he grew more involved in the revolutionary movement, he began to develop his own theories and strategies for carrying out a successful revolution. One of the most pivotal decisions Lenin made during this period was to commit himself fully to the cause of a socialist revolution in Russia, one that would fundamentally alter the political structure of the empire. Lenin's commitment to revolutionary change was not an abstract intellectual exercise, but a deeply personal and urgent necessity. Russia, under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, was an empire marked by deep inequalities. The autocracy was oppressive, the majority of the population lived in poverty, and the political elite maintained their power through repression and control. Lenin, with his exposure to Marxism and his growing understanding of the social injustices around him, concluded that the existing system could not be reformed. It had to be overthrown. The decision to become an active revolutionary came with significant personal sacrifice. Lenin's earlier involvement in political activities, including his participation in the Union for the Liberation of the Working Class, had already led to his exile in Siberia. While in exile, Lenin immersed himself in Marxist literature, and his ideas began to take a sharper, more practical focus. He came to believe that in order to overthrow the Tsarist regime, a highly organized, disciplined revolutionary party was necessary. This party, Lenin argued, would lead the working class and the peasantry in a revolution, providing the direction and the means to achieve political power. This idea of a vanguard party was a defining moment in Lenin's intellectual development. Marx had written about the need for the working class to overthrow the capitalist system, but Lenin saw the Russian Revolution as requiring a leadership element that Marx had not fully developed in his writings. Lenin's vanguard party would be a small, tightly knit group of professional revolutionaries, guided by a unified ideology and committed to a central strategic approach to overthrowing the ruling regime. Lenin's decision to embrace the idea of the vanguard party set him apart from many other Marxists of the time. While some believed that the revolution would be a spontaneous movement driven by the masses, Lenin's vision was more structured. He believed that the workers, though the most oppressed class, were not yet capable of leading a revolution on their own. They needed a political organization that could guide them, educate them, and provide the direction necessary to overthrow the state. The vanguard party, in Lenin's view, would be the spearhead of the revolution, leading the way and preparing the workers for their ultimate role in the overthrow of Tsarism. This decision, this embrace of a more centralized strategic approach to revolution, was not without its risks. Lenin understood that his ideas were controversial, even among other revolutionaries. Many within the socialist movement believed that the revolution would come naturally, driven by the will of the people. Lenin, however, saw the need for professional revolutionaries who could direct the masses and keep the movement on track. He was willing to take risks, make sacrifices, and dedicate his life to this cause, convinced that it was the only way to achieve the change that Russia so desperately needed. As Lenin's thinking solidified, so did his commitment to action. He began to advocate for the creation of a political party that would not only challenge the Tsarist regime but eventually lead to the establishment of a socialist state. This was a major turning point in Lenin's life. While he'd been involved in revolutionary activities before, this moment marked the point at which Lenin truly understood the depth of the commitment required for the kind of revolution he envisioned. It was no longer enough to be a theoretical Marxist or a passive participant in the revolutionary cause. Lenin now saw himself as a leader of the movement, a leader who would guide Russia through the turbulent years to come. This was also a time of increasing radicalization within Russia. The Tsarist regime, threatened by the growing revolutionary movements, had begun to crack down harder on dissidents. In response, Lenin's ideas became more radical, his commitment to revolution more unwavering. He called for a more forceful response to the Tsarist state, and emphasized the need for the working class to rise up and take power. This was a defining moment in his life. one that would set the course for the Russian Revolution and shape the future of the Soviet Union. As Lenin's leadership in the movement grew, so did his ideological influence. His writings during this period, particularly his work on the role of the Revolutionary Party, laid the foundation for what would later be known as Leninism. His belief in the need for a strong, disciplined party that could lead the revolution would become the central tenet of his political philosophy. This philosophy would guide Lenin throughout his life and influence the future course of history. Despite the risks and opposition to his ideas, Lenin remained steadfast in his belief that the time for revolution had come. His personal sacrifices were immense, and his life became one dedicated to the cause of overthrowing the Tsarist state and establishing a new socialist society. The decision to create a vanguard party was a turning point in Lenin's life, a decision that would shape not only his destiny, but also the fate of Russia and the world. This moment of change marked the beginning of a journey that would culminate in the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the creation of the Soviet Union that followed. In the years to come, Lenin's vision of revolution would be tested, refined, and put into practice. His commitment to the cause, his ability to inspire others, and his unwavering belief in the necessity of change would make him one of the most significant and controversial figures of the 20th century. But it all began with that critical decision to commit fully to the cause of revolution, to embrace the idea of the vanguard party, and to take action in pursuit of a new socialist future. By the early 20th century, Vladimir Lenin had become an established figure in the Russian revolutionary movement, committed to the Marxist cause and determined to overthrow the Tsarist regime. However, as his influence grew, so did the challenges and conflicts that would test both his political ideology and his personal resolve. Lenin's life during this period was marked by ideological battles within the socialist movement, increasing repression from the Tsarist government, and the growing tension between different factions of the revolutionary cause. One of the earliest and most significant conflicts Lenin faced was internal division within the Russian socialist movement. Marxist thought in Russia had begun to splinter, with differing schools of thought emerging on how to best achieve the revolution. The primary division was between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, the latter led by Lenin himself. The Mensheviks were more moderate in their approach, advocating for a broad-based party that included workers, peasants, and intellectuals. They believed that the revolution would come in stages, and that the working class needed to ally with the bourgeoisie in a democratic revolution before socialism could be realized. In contrast, Lenin and the Bolsheviks held a more radical vision. Lenin argued that the bourgeoisie would never be a reliable ally in the revolution, and that the working class needed to seize power directly, without waiting for a gradual transformation. The Bolsheviks, in Lenin's view, should be a disciplined, centralized party, focused on the leadership of the proletariat in a direct and violent overthrow of the existing regime. This ideological conflict between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks would shape much of the revolutionary landscape in the years to come, with Lenin's faction eventually emerging as the dominant force in the Russian Revolution. The ideological disagreements within the Russian socialist movement were not the only source of conflict for Lenin. By 1905, the political situation in Russia was rapidly deteriorating. The country was facing growing unrest, with strikes and protests erupting across the empire. The Russian economy was in turmoil, and the working class was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the Tsarist regime. The failed war with Japan, 1904 to 1905, had humiliated the Tsar, and the people's frustration with the monarchy was reaching a breaking point. In response to the growing discontent, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to concede to some reforms, including the creation of the Duma, a legislative assembly, in an effort to placate the populace. However, the Duma was weak and largely ineffective, and the Tsar continued to resist meaningful political change. For Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this was a pivotal moment. While many socialists, including the Mensheviks, believed that the Duma could provide a peaceful avenue for reform, Lenin saw it as nothing more than a facade designed to maintain the Tsar's power. The Mensheviks' belief in gradual reform clashed sharply with Lenin's revolutionary urgency. In 1905, the Russo-Japanese War and the Bloody Sunday Massacre, when peaceful protesters were gunned down by Tsarist forces, sparked a wave of strikes, protests, and uprisings. Lenin, despite his relatively modest status as revolutionary leader at the time, saw these events as evidence of the broader potential for revolution. The 1905 revolution, though ultimately unsuccessful, would prove to be a formative moment for Lenin. It demonstrated the volatility of the political landscape and the possibility of mobilizing the masses in an uprising against the Tsar. Though the 1905 revolution ended in defeat, it solidified Lenin's conviction that Russia was ripe for revolution. However, Lenin also recognized the importance of discipline within the revolutionary movement. His commitment to the idea of the Vanguard Party, a tightly controlled, ideologically unified organization of professional revolutionaries, became all the more important in the wake of the 1905 events. He believed that the revolution would only succeed if it was led by a small group of determined, committed individuals who could maintain control and guide the workers and peasants toward their ultimate goal of overthrowing the monarchy. The failure of the 1905 revolution did not deter Lenin. Instead, it reinforced his belief that the revolution would be a long and difficult struggle, one that would require perseverance, strategic thinking, and a willingness to make difficult decisions. Lenin's ideological battles with other socialists, particularly the Mensheviks, were a reflection of his broader understanding that the path to revolution would be fraught with conflict, both external and internal. Lenin's ability to navigate these conflicts, his determination to push forward with his vision, and his willingness to challenge other factions in the socialist movement would set the stage for his future leadership in the Russian Revolution of 1917. In addition to the ideological struggles, Lenin was constantly under threat from the Tsarist police. His writings were banned, and his movements were closely monitored by the secret police, known as the Okhrana. Lenin spent much of this period in exile, moving from country to country in Europe to avoid arrest. Despite the constant surveillance, Lenin remained a tireless advocate for revolution, writing prolifically and building a network of supporters across Europe. His time in exile allowed him to build alliances with other revolutionary groups, including the Social Democratic Labour Party, which was divided into its own factions. Though Lenin's political career was marked by adversity, his ability to adapt to difficult situations was one of his greatest strengths. The obstacles he faced, both from within the revolutionary movement and from the Tsarist government, only served to strengthen his resolve. Lenin's unflinching commitment to the cause of revolution, his willingness to engage in ideological battles, and his focus on the long-term goal of overthrowing the Tsarist regime would ultimately lead him to triumph in the Russian Revolution of 1917. The conflict that Lenin faced during these years was not only about ideological purity, but also about practical strategy. Lenin's understanding of how to move the revolutionary movement forward was shaped by the events of 1905 and the internal conflicts within the socialist movement. His ability to steer the Bolshevik Party through these turbulent times and maintain a unified vision would become essential in the lead-up to the 1917 revolution. Lenin's focus on building a strong, disciplined organization, his commitment to armed struggle, and his unwavering belief in the necessity of revolution would ultimately define his leadership. By the time of the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Vladimir Lenin had firmly established himself as one of the most prominent figures in the Russian revolutionary movement. Though he had spent much of his life in exile, Lenin had remained a tireless advocate for the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the establishment of a socialist government in Russia. His writings had shaped the direction of the revolutionary movement, and his commitment to the cause had never wavered, even in the face of constant repression from the Tsarist government. Now, with the war raging across Europe, Lenin's vision for revolution would be tested like never before. The war, which had initially caused Lenin to worry about the possibility of a socialist revolution being delayed, ultimately created an opportunity for his ideas to gain traction. As the war dragged on, disillusionment with the Tsarist regime grew, both among the general population and within the military. The war exposed the weaknesses of the Russian Empire, and the costs of the conflict became unbearable for the working class and the peasants, who were forced to bear the brunt of the suffering. The Russian army was faltering, the economy was in disarray, and public morale had collapsed. Lenin, in exile in Switzerland, saw the war as a moment of crisis for the Russian state and a potential opportunity for revolution. In 1915, he wrote his famous work, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in which he argued that the war was a manifestation of the capitalist system's contradictions. According to Lenin, imperialism, the domination of weaker nations by stronger capitalist powers, was a natural outcome of the capitalist system, and the war was simply an extension of these imperialist ambitions. Lenin believed that the war provided a unique opportunity for revolution, as the working class, exhausted by the war and the hardships it imposed, would be ripe for a socialist uprising. In 1917, with the war still raging, events in Russia began to take a dramatic turn. The Tsarist government, already weakened by years of mismanagement and repression, collapsed in the February Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and the Russian monarchy was replaced by a provisional government. However, the provisional government was weak, divided, and unable to meet the demands of the people. It promised reform but failed to end the war or address the deep economic problems facing the country. The workers, soldiers, and peasants, frustrated by the continuing war and worsening conditions, began to demand more radical change. For Lenin, the February Revolution was a pivotal moment. It confirmed what he had believed for years. The Tsarist regime could not be reformed, and only a revolutionary overthrow of the existing system could bring about true change. But Lenin was also acutely aware that the revolution was still unfinished. The provisional government, though it had overthrown the monarchy, was still made up of the same political elites, and was not committed to the full socialist transformation that Lenin envisioned. Lenin understood that the revolution had to be pushed further, and this required the Bolsheviks to seize power. Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917, after years of exile. His arrival was both a moment of celebration and a signal of the decisive steps that needed to be taken. At this point, the Bolshevik Party, though still a minority in the revolutionary movement, had grown in strength. Lenin's leadership and ideas had shaped the party's platform, and the Bolsheviks were becoming the leading force in the struggle for power. Lenin's return was greeted with enthusiasm by the workers and soldiers, who saw in him the leadership they had been waiting for. Upon his return, Lenin wasted no time in outlining his vision for the future. In his April thesis, Lenin called for the complete overthrow of the provisional government, the transfer of power to the Soviets, workers' councils, and the establishment of a socialist government. He rejected the idea of a bourgeois revolution, and instead called for a second stage of revolution, one that would eliminate the remnants of the old system and create a new government based on the interests of the working class and the peasantry. Lenin's call for radical change was not universally accepted, even within the socialist movement. The Mensheviks, the moderate wing of the Russian socialist movement, argued that the provisional government should be allowed to continue its work, and that the revolution should proceed in stages. Lenin, however, was convinced that only a complete break with the old order would lead to true liberation for the people of Russia. He argued that the time had come for the Bolsheviks to lead the revolution to its final stage, and that the power of the state had to be transferred to the workers and peasants immediately. Lenin's message resonated with the masses, and the Bolshevik Party began to gain increasing support. The provisional government, meanwhile, continued to struggle with its inability to address the demands of the people, particularly its continued involvement in World War I. As the situation in Russia became more chaotic, Lenin's call for an immediate, complete revolution gained traction. In October 1917, the Bolshevik Party seized power in the October Revolution, a dramatic moment that would mark the beginning of a new era for Russia and the world. The success of the October Revolution was a culmination of Lenin's efforts to build a revolutionary movement that could mobilize the masses and seize power. But it was also the beginning of an incredibly difficult and turbulent period. After taking power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced fierce opposition from the old ruling classes, including the military, the aristocracy, and other factions within the socialist movement. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, ensued, with the Bolsheviks fighting against the White Army, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. The war was brutal, and millions of Russians died from combat, starvation, and disease. Despite these immense challenges, Lenin's leadership was crucial in ensuring the survival of the Bolshevik regime. Under his guidance, the Bolsheviks were able to win the Civil War, consolidate power, and lay the foundations for the Soviet Union. Lenin's policies during this period, including the nationalization of industry, land redistribution, and the establishment of a one-party state, were designed to secure the revolution and ensure that the working class would remain in power. By the time of his death in 1924, Lenin had successfully transformed Russia from an autocratic empire into the world's first socialist state. His legacy was one of profound change, from the overthrow of the Tsarist regime to the creation of a new political and economic order. However, Lenin's vision of socialism was still in its infancy, and his death left a power vacuum within the Bolshevik Party. The struggle for leadership would soon give rise to the figure of Joseph Stalin, whose policies would diverge significantly from Lenin's own, but that would be a story for a later time. Lenin's achievements during his lifetime, however, were monumental. He had led the Bolshevik Party through one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history, helped to bring about the end of Tsarist rule, and laid the foundation for the establishment of the Soviet Union. His legacy, while controversial, was undeniable. Lenin had changed the course of history, and the world would never be the same. By 1920, Lenin had led the Bolshevik Party through the chaos of the October Revolution and the tumult of the Russian Civil War. Under his leadership, the party had consolidated power, and the Soviet state had begun to take shape. However, despite the victory of the Bolsheviks, Lenin's journey was far from over. As the leader of the new Soviet government, Lenin faced numerous challenges, many of which tested not only his revolutionary ideals but also his physical and mental endurance. Lenin's rise to power had been rapid, but maintaining control of the revolution was a more complicated task. The Civil War had left Russia in ruins, with the economy in shambles and millions of people displaced. The Bolsheviks had to rebuild the country from the ground up, while at the same time fighting off internal and external enemies. The economic situation was dire, and the people were growing increasingly disillusioned with the promises of the revolution. Lenin's government had to find ways to stabilize the country, restore order, and provide for the basic needs of the population. One of the most significant challenges Lenin faced was the deepening economic crisis. The war had devastated Russia's infrastructure, and the economy was heavily dependent on a wartime economy. The Bolsheviks had nationalized industries and redistributed land, but the country was still struggling with famine, shortages, and inflation. Lenin had hoped that the revolution would bring about a new, more equitable economic order. But the reality of governing a country in the midst of a civil war made this ideal difficult to achieve. To address the crisis, Lenin introduced a series of economic policies aimed at stabilizing the country. In 1921, after the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, Lenin implemented the New Economic Policy, NEP. The NEP marked a significant shift in policy, as it allowed some degree of private enterprise and market activity. Under the NEP, small businesses were allowed to operate, and peasants were allowed to sell surplus grain on the open market. This policy was a practical response to the economic hardships that the Soviet Union was facing, and it helped to restore some level of economic stability. However, the NEP was also a compromise. It represented a departure from the more radical policies that Lenin had initially espoused. Some members of the Bolshevik Party, particularly those on the left, viewed the NEP as a betrayal of the revolution's original goals. They argued that allowing private enterprise and market activity would undermine the socialist nature of the state and give rise to capitalist tendencies. Lenin, however, believed that the NEP was a necessary step to ensure the survival of the Soviet state. He argued that the revolution had to be preserved first, and that the NEP was a temporary measure to help rebuild the economy before a full transition to socialism could take place. The introduction of the NEP was a turning point for Lenin. It marked a moment of pragmatism and political realism where Lenin had to confront the realities of governance. The NEP was not a perfect solution, but it allowed the Soviet Union to recover from the devastating effects of war and to begin the long process of rebuilding. However, this policy also exposed some of the contradictions within Lenin's vision for the revolution. The need to balance the ideals of socialism with the practical realities of governing a war-torn country highlighted the limits of Lenin's revolutionary project. In addition to the economic challenges, Lenin was also faced with political and ideological opposition within the Bolshevik Party itself. The most significant of these challenges came from the growing influence of Joseph Stalin, a member of the Bolshevik leadership who had gained prominence during the revolution and the Civil War. While Stalin was a loyal supporter of Lenin, their relationship would soon become strained. Lenin began to criticize Stalin for his harsh methods and his concentration of power within the party. In 1922, Lenin wrote a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, known as the Testament, in which he expressed his concerns about Stalin's leadership style and his growing influence. Lenin's concerns about Stalin were rooted in his belief that the Soviet Union needed a collective leadership, one that was based on democratic centralism and the free exchange of ideas. Lenin feared that Stalin's authoritarian tendencies and his lack of respect for party democracy could undermine the principles of the revolution. In his testament, Lenin called for Stalin's removal from the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. However, Lenin's health was failing, and his political influence was diminishing. His testament was never fully implemented, and Stalin's power continued to grow. Lenin's declining health was another major challenge during this period. In 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and unable to carry out his duties as leader of the Soviet Union. Over the next few years, Lenin's health continued to deteriorate, and he was forced to withdraw from active political life. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Lenin's life, as he struggled with both his physical decline and the growing political challenges within the Bolshevik Party. Lenin's personal struggle with illness was mirrored by the larger struggle within the Soviet state, as the revolutionary ideals he'd fought for were increasingly challenged by the demands of governance and the realities of political power. During this time, Lenin turned his attention to the future of the revolution and the direction of the Soviet Union. He recognized that the revolution could not be sustained without strong, competent leadership. However, Lenin also feared that the party was becoming increasingly centralized, and that the revolutionary ideals of the early days of the Bolshevik movement were being compromised. His criticisms of Stalin were a reflection of his larger concerns about the direction of the revolution and the concentration of power in the hands of a single leader. As Lenin's health continued to decline, the question of succession became more pressing. The political dynamics within the Bolshevik Party were shifting, and Lenin's death, which seemed increasingly inevitable, would leave a power vacuum that could lead to further internal strife. Lenin's inability to address these issues personally highlighted the fragility of the revolution he had worked so hard to build. His later years were marked by a growing sense of uncertainty about the future of the Soviet state and the direction of the communist movement. As the leader of the Bolshevik Party and the first head of the Soviet Union, Lenin had achieved many of his revolutionary aims. The overthrow of the Tsarist regime, the establishment of a socialist state, and the end of centuries of autocracy marked monumental achievements. Yet, as the revolution unfolded and the Soviet state began to take shape, Lenin found himself reflecting on the deep changes sweeping across Russia, changes that not only affected the political structure, but also the social fabric of the country. When Lenin came to power in 1917, Russia was a society deeply rooted in its history of feudalism, serfdom, and autocracy. The majority of the population was illiterate, poverty-stricken, and burdened by centuries of inequality. The challenge of building a new socialist society out of this deeply entrenched system was daunting. Yet, Lenin's vision was one of profound transformation. To create a society where the working class, peasants, and all marginalized groups could achieve their rightful place in the political, economic, and social order. One of Lenin's key ideas was to redistribute land to the peasants. In the early days of Bolshevik rule, the government issued decrees that redistributed land to the people, breaking up the vast estates of the aristocracy and turning them over to the peasants. The goal was to dismantle the old feudal structure and give the peasantry a stake in the new society. For many peasants, this was a momentous change, and they eagerly embraced the opportunity to own the land they worked on for the first time. However, the implementation of land redistribution did not come without complications. The Soviet state, still in its infancy and grappling with the aftermath of civil war, struggled to provide support for the millions of peasants who now controlled the land. Many peasants lacked the knowledge, tools, and resources to farm the land efficiently. The collective farms that Lenin and his supporters envisioned as part of the socialist project were slow to materialize. This mismatch between the ideals of socialist collectivism and the realities of the agrarian economy led to difficulties in managing the land redistribution effectively. Another significant area of change was the transformation of labor relations. Lenin's government sought to create a state-controlled economy that would ensure the fair treatment of workers. This was done through the nationalization of major industries, including banking, transportation, and manufacturing. The Bolshevik government sought to replace capitalist exploitation with a system in which workers would collectively own and manage the means of production. Yet, as the revolution progressed, Lenin realized that this process of economic transformation was more complicated than he had initially envisioned. Industrial workers, while benefiting from the new government's focus on labor rights, were often still faced with difficult conditions. The Soviet government struggled to balance the need for central planning with the demands for workers' control. Lenin believed that the state had to guide the economy, but this often led to tensions between the state's authority and workers' self-management. The urban working class, though initially supportive of the Bolshevik government, began to face hardships as the revolution entered its later phases. The economy was still in ruins, and workers found themselves dealing with shortages of goods, inflation, and difficult working conditions. The government struggled to meet the demands of workers while also facing the pressures of the Civil War, foreign intervention, and the need to consolidate power within the Soviet state. For Lenin, the revolution was not just about the redistribution of land or the nationalization of industry. It was about the creation of a new society in which all individuals could realize their full potential. However, the realities of governance often collided with the lofty ideals of the revolution. Lenin's vision was clear, but the path to realizing that vision was fraught with obstacles. The transition from a feudal autocratic society to a modern socialist state was not a simple or smooth process. One of the most profound changes Lenin sought to bring about was in the cultural and intellectual spheres. Under Tsarist rule, Russian society was stifled by censorship, repression, and the suppression of new ideas. Lenin believed that the revolution should not only transform the political and economic structures of society, but also its cultural life. He sought to promote the arts, education, and intellectual freedom, all in service of the new socialist ideals. However, the implementation of this vision was far from easy. Lenin's government faced challenges in reforming education and culture, while also dealing with the ongoing demands of the Civil War. The Soviet state began to implement programs to promote literacy and education, particularly in rural areas, but these efforts were slow to take root. The Bolshevik government also encouraged the development of new forms of art and literature that would reflect the ideals of the revolution. Artists, writers, and intellectuals were encouraged to create works that celebrated the working class and the struggles of the revolution. However, these efforts were often hampered by the difficult conditions of the time and the ongoing political and economic instability. Lenin's vision of a new open society clashed with the realities of state control. The more the Soviet government sought to control the economy, the more it found itself regulating the cultural life of the country. Lenin believed that art should serve the people, but as the years passed, the question of what constituted revolutionary art became a point of contention. Despite his early support for artistic freedom, the Soviet state began to impose stricter guidelines on artistic expression, and artists and intellectuals found themselves increasingly subject to state censorship. The rapid pace of change that Lenin had initiated in Russia created an atmosphere of uncertainty. The old world was collapsing, and the new world had yet to fully emerge. Lenin, for all his achievements, was aware of the profound challenges that lay ahead for the Soviet state. As he struggled with health issues in the final years of his life, he reflected on the difficulties of creating a truly socialist society. He understood that the revolution was not a one-time event, but a long, ongoing process that would require continuous struggle. Yet, despite the many challenges, Lenin remained committed to the revolutionary project. He saw the changes in Russia as only the beginning, a foundation upon which the future of the Soviet Union would be built. While his vision for a classless society was still far from complete, Lenin's leadership had irrevocably changed the course of Russian and world history. By 1922, Lenin's health had begun to significantly deteriorate, marking a shift in both his personal life and the course of the revolution he'd fought so hard to create. Although the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union were remarkable achievements, Lenin now found himself grappling with the consequences of those victories. The pressure of leadership, the weight of the revolution, and the toll of ill health all began to change Lenin's role within the party and his vision for the future of the Soviet state. After years of leading the revolution and consolidating Bolshevik power, Lenin's life took on a more reflective tone. The idealism that had fueled his early revolutionary fervour was now tempered by the immense challenges of governing. Lenin had become deeply aware of the growing tensions within the Bolshevik party and the increasing concentration of power. While he'd always believed in a centralized disciplined party, he now found himself questioning whether the internal dynamics of the party were truly aligned with the values of the revolution. One of the most significant changes in Lenin's later years was his growing concern about the direction of the Soviet government. Lenin had always been a strong believer in collective leadership, but as the political landscape evolved, he began to see signs of centralization and authoritarianism within the party. Lenin's own health problems, including a stroke in 1922 that left him partially paralyzed, forced him to withdraw from active political life. While still able to write and communicate, he was no longer able to exert the same influence over day-to-day decisions in the government. During this time, Lenin became increasingly concerned about the rise of Joseph Stalin, who'd become an influential figure within the Bolshevik Party. Stalin's consolidation of power, particularly his role as General Secretary of the Communist Party, was a source of growing unease for Lenin. Stalin had gained influence through his administrative abilities, his loyalty to Lenin, and his ruthless political maneuvering. However, Lenin, despite his health decline, recognized that Stalin's methods, his harsh treatment of party members and his growing power base, could threaten the future of the revolution. Lenin's concerns about Stalin were articulated in his testament, a document written in 1922 in which he criticized Stalin's leadership style. He accused Stalin of being too forceful and unaccountable, with a tendency to act in an authoritarian manner. Lenin recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. He believed that Stalin's concentration of power could undermine the collective leadership principle and jeopardize the future of the Soviet Union. Lenin's fears were not just about Stalin's character, they were about the broader implications for the Soviet state and the revolution's long-term success. However, Lenin's political influence had waned by the time his testament was written. Due to his declining health and the political complexities within the party, the document was not widely circulated. Lenin's criticism of Stalin was not immediately acted upon, and Stalin remained in power, gradually positioning himself as the leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. While Lenin's testament was not fully implemented, it nonetheless foreshadowed the intense power struggle that would follow his death in 1924. Beyond his concerns about Stalin, Lenin's later years were also marked by a sense of frustration with the pace and direction of the revolution. The immediate aftermath of the Civil War had brought relative stability, but the country remained deeply divided. The economic challenges were not easily overcome, and many of the revolutionary ideals Lenin had championed seemed at odds with the realities of governance. Lenin had always believed that the revolution would lead to the creation of a more just society, but as time passed, he grew increasingly skeptical about the ability of the Soviet government to fulfill that promise. Lenin's relationships within the party were also undergoing significant shifts. While he'd always been surrounded by close allies, the pressures of leadership and the growing internal divisions began to strain those relationships. Lenin's concerns about Stalin were compounded by his frustrations with the lack of ideological unity within the party. The Bolshevik leadership was not a monolith. It was divided between those who favoured a more pragmatic, less ideologically rigid approach to governance, and those who remained committed to the original ideals of the revolution. Lenin's own ideas were evolving, and he began to worry that the party's direction might veer away from his vision. As Lenin struggled with his health, his relationship with his comrades, including Leon Trotsky, became more strained. Trotsky had been one of Lenin's closest allies during the Revolution and the Civil War, and he had played a crucial role in organizing the Red Army. However, Trotsky's more radical approach to revolution and his growing influence within the party created tensions with Lenin, who had always valued party unity. Despite these tensions, Lenin and Trotsky remained aligned in many of their goals, and Lenin continued to see Trotsky as an essential part of the Bolshevik leadership. Nonetheless, the internal struggles within the party were becoming more pronounced, and Lenin's health made it increasingly difficult for him to mediate those conflicts. Throughout his later years, Lenin remained deeply committed to the revolutionary cause, but he was also keenly aware of the complexities of leadership and the difficulties of creating a new society out of the ruins of the old. His health issues forced him to slow down, but they also gave him time to reflect on the nature of power, governance, and the future of the Soviet Union. As Lenin's influence within the party began to wane, the question of succession became increasingly important, and the rivalries and ideological divisions within the Bolshevik leadership grew more pronounced. In the years following his stroke, Lenin continued to write, though his health made it difficult to do so with the same vigour as before. His final works, including critiques of the party and reflections on the future of the revolution, reveal a leader who was deeply concerned about the survival of the revolution he had helped create. He recognized that the revolution was still fragile, and that its future would depend on the ability of the Soviet government to navigate the complex political, economic, and social challenges that lay ahead. As Lenin's life drew to a close, his legacy was already beginning to take shape. The Soviet Union, though still in its infancy, had been transformed by the revolution. Lenin's leadership had shaped the trajectory of Russian history, and his ideas had become the foundation for the Soviet system. Yet, in his final years, Lenin was deeply ambivalent about the future. He had achieved much, but he was also increasingly aware of the challenges that the revolution still faced. Challenges that would outlast his lifetime. Lenin's health in the final years of his life was a constant source of concern both personally and politically. In 1922, a series of strokes left him partially paralyzed and severely weakened. Although he had once been a tireless leader, capable of rallying the masses and leading the revolutionary movement, he now found himself unable to fully participate in the affairs of the government he had worked so hard to establish. The very qualities that had defined his life, his clarity of thought, his sharp political insight, and his commanding presence, were increasingly diminished by the debilitating effects of his strokes. Lenin's physical decline had a profound impact on the Soviet Union, as well as on the internal dynamics of the Bolshevik Party. Up until this point, Lenin had been the undisputed leader of the revolution, guiding the party through the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and the early stages of state building. However, with his health deteriorating, the question of succession and the future direction of the revolution became pressing concerns. Lenin had always believed in collective leadership, but his inability to lead directly and his growing isolation within the party set the stage for intense power struggles in the years to come. As Lenin's health worsened, he withdrew more and more from active political life. He continued to write, but his communications became less frequent, and his ability to influence events diminished. Despite this, Lenin remained deeply concerned about the future of the Soviet Union and the survival of the revolution. The leadership of the Bolshevik Party was now fractured, with various factions vying for influence and control. This growing factionalism within the party was a direct result of Lenin's absence from the political scene, and it threatened to undermine the unity that had been a hallmark of the revolution. In his final months, Lenin began to reflect on the direction the revolution had taken. The initial goals of the Bolshevik movement, the establishment of a socialist state, the dismantling of the old class system, and the empowerment of the working class, had been partially achieved. Yet Lenin recognized that many of the ideals of the revolution had not been fully realized. The Soviet Union remained a deeply challenging and precarious project, one that required careful and thoughtful leadership to ensure its survival. Lenin's growing concerns about the future of the revolution were also influenced by his awareness of the rise of Joseph Stalin, a key member of the Bolshevik leadership. While Stalin had proven himself a loyal ally during the revolution and the Civil War, Lenin began to see signs of authoritarianism in Stalin's leadership style. Stalin's increasing control over the Communist Party and his harsh methods of dealing with opposition raised alarms for Lenin. Stalin's concentration of power threatened the collective leadership Lenin had long championed, and this made Lenin uneasy. In his final years, Lenin sought to address these concerns. In his testament, a document he wrote in 1922 but which was not widely circulated until after his death, Lenin expressed his growing dissatisfaction with Stalin's conduct. He criticized Stalin's rude manners, his lack of tact, and his authoritarian tendencies. Lenin even recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that gave Stalin significant control over party appointments and administrative decisions. However, By the time Lenin's concerns were formally addressed, he was no longer in a position to exert the necessary influence to make any significant changes. While Lenin was deeply troubled by the rise of Stalin, he was also keenly aware of the challenges that lay ahead for the Soviet state. He understood that the revolution could not be sustained without strong leadership, but he feared that the concentration of power in any one individual's hands could lead to the erosion of the revolutionary ideals he had fought for. Lenin's struggle during these years was not only one of physical decline, but also one of ideological frustration. He had envisioned a society where collective leadership and democratic centralism would prevail, but he saw these principles being undermined by the growing dominance of Stalin and others who were consolidating power. Lenin's political writings during this period became increasingly reflective. He spent much of his remaining time analyzing the party's internal conflicts and trying to chart a course for the future of the revolution. Despite his physical limitations, Lenin continued to express his hopes for a better future, one that would be shaped by the values of socialism and equality. However, these writings, particularly his criticism of Stalin, were not acted upon in time to prevent the rise of an authoritarian regime in the Soviet Union. Lenin's final years were a time of personal struggle and political uncertainty. His health continued to decline, and his once powerful influence within the party waned. Yet even as his physical abilities diminished, Lenin's commitment to the revolution and the socialist ideals that had guided him throughout his life remained unwavering. He continued to speak out against the centralization of power and the dangers of authoritarianism, but his efforts to influence the course of the Soviet state were limited by his failing health and the growing dominance of Stalin. Despite the challenges he faced, Lenin remained a deeply respected figure within the Bolshevik Party and in the wider revolutionary movement. His leadership had transformed Russia, and his ideas continued to shape the trajectory of the Soviet Union. However, Lenin's death in 1924 left a power vacuum that would soon be filled by Stalin. The struggles and ideological debates that Lenin had initiated in his final years would continue to shape the Soviet Union long after his passing. Lenin died on January 21, 1924, after a long period of illness. His passing marked the end of an era for the Soviet Union, but his legacy would live on in the state he had helped create. Lenin had built the foundation for the Soviet Union, but the challenges of maintaining the revolution and realizing its ideals were far from over. His death and the subsequent rise of Stalin marked a new phase in the history of the Soviet Union, one that would be marked by a shift toward authoritarian rule and the eventual abandonment of many of the democratic principles Lenin had espoused. Lenin's decline in health and his ultimate death were a reflection of the profound toll that the revolution had taken on him. Despite his physical limitations, Lenin's mind remained sharp, and his commitment to the revolution remained strong. He was deeply aware of the challenges that the Soviet state would face after his death, and he struggled to ensure that the revolution he had led would continue on the path he'd envisioned. But the forces within the party, particularly the rise of Stalin, would eventually chart a different course for the Soviet Union, one that Lenin may not have recognized. Vladimir Lenin's final days were a period of reflection, both for him and for the revolutionary state he had built. As his health continued to decline, his role in the Soviet Union became less direct, and his influence over the party and its policies diminished. Yet, even in the face of his failing health, Lenin remained acutely aware of the implications of his legacy. His mind, though often clouded by the effects of his strokes, remained sharp, and his thoughts on the future of the revolution were unyielding. The years leading up to his death were marked by a growing sense of urgency. Lenin, in his weakened state, had little time to ensure the future direction of the revolution. His concerns about the centralization of power, particularly regarding Joseph Stalin, had been voiced, but by 1924, his ability to influence events within the Bolshevik Party had waned. Despite his warnings, Stalin's position continued to solidify, and the future of the Soviet state began to look more uncertain. Lenin had always believed in the collective leadership of the party, but as his physical condition worsened, he saw a growing authoritarianism that he feared would undermine the principles of the revolution. Lenin's health rapidly deteriorated after his third stroke in late 1922. He was no longer able to participate in the day-to-day workings of the government, or to engage with the party in the same capacity as before. His final months were spent mostly in isolation, away from the political battles that were increasingly being fought within the Bolshevik leadership. Lenin's withdrawal from active leadership left a vacuum that would soon be filled by other members of the party, most notably Stalin. The internal struggles for power within the party grew more intense as Lenin's condition worsened, and the fate of the Soviet Union seemed to hinge on the decisions of its leadership, not on the ideals of the revolution that Lenin had championed. During his last months, Lenin's thoughts often turned to the future of the Soviet Union and the course of the revolution. He was deeply concerned about the consolidation of power by Stalin, whose methods of leadership Lenin found increasingly troubling. In his final writings, particularly his Testament, Lenin expressed his fears that the party's internal divisions would lead to the destruction of the revolution. His letter to the Central Committee was a reflection of his deep anxiety about the future, a future he felt was being jeopardized by the very forces he had fought so hard to defeat. Lenin urged the removal of Stalin from his position as General Secretary, though his words would ultimately fall on deaf ears. On January 21, 1924, Lenin passed away at the age of 53. His death marked the end of an era for the Soviet Union and the communist movement. The revolution he had led, and the new socialist state he'd helped establish, now faced an uncertain future. Lenin's passing left the party in a state of transition, with no clear successor to guide the revolution forward. Despite the challenges and struggles that had marked the final years of his life, Lenin's death left a legacy that was undeniable, one that would continue to shape the Soviet Union for years to come. In the days following his death, the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet government went into mourning. Lenin's funeral became a significant moment in Soviet history, with crowds of workers, soldiers, and peasants gathering to pay their respects. Lenin's body was embalmed and placed on display in the Red Square in Moscow, where it would remain for decades as a symbol of his leadership and the revolution he had helped create. The public mourning for Lenin was not just about honoring a fallen leader. It was about the recognition of the profound changes that had taken place in Russia and the world. While Lenin's death marked the end of his direct influence over the Soviet Union, his legacy continued to shape the country and the global communist movement. The ideals of the revolution, the promise of equality, justice, and the empowerment of the working class remained central to the Soviet government's rhetoric, even as the political realities of Stalin's rule took shape. Lenin's name was invoked constantly by those in power, and his legacy was used to justify the policies of the state. However, as time passed, the reality of Stalin's leadership would diverge significantly from the principles Lenin had espoused. The vision of a collective democratic leadership was replaced by one-man rule, and the policies of terror and repression that characterized Stalin's reign stood in stark contrast to the ideals of the early revolution. Despite the betrayals of his vision, Lenin's legacy continued to influence Soviet policy throughout the 20th century. The Leninist ideals of party discipline, centralized control, and revolutionary zeal remained key components of the Soviet system, even as they were distorted by Stalin's authoritarianism. Lenin's revolutionary ideas laid the foundation for the Soviet state, and his image became an enduring symbol of the revolution. Outside the Soviet Union, Lenin's impact was felt in many parts of the world. The Russian Revolution had inspired socialist movements in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, and Lenin's ideas were studied and debated by revolutionaries everywhere. His legacy was particularly influential in the formation of communist parties in China, Vietnam, and other countries, where his model of revolutionary struggle and party organization was adopted, though often with variations. In the decades after Lenin's death, his legacy became a point of contention within the Soviet Union. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was a movement to re-evaluate Lenin's role and the policies of his successors. Some sought to return to the ideals of the early revolution, emphasizing Lenin's commitment to collective leadership and his vision of socialism. Others, however, sought to distance themselves from Lenin's vision and to justify the authoritarian state that had developed under Stalin. Lenin's impact, however, cannot be denied. He transformed Russia from an autocratic empire into the world's first socialist state. His ideas and leadership helped shape the course of the 20th century, and his name remains synonymous with revolution. The Soviet Union, though it would eventually dissolve in 1991, was built on the foundations laid by Lenin and his vision of a new world order, a world in which the working class would be liberated from the shackles of capitalism and oppression. Vladimir Lenin's legacy is one of the most profound and complex in world history. His leadership of the Russian Revolution and his role in the establishment of the Soviet Union changed the course of the 20th century. Lenin's influence on socialist thought and revolutionary movements across the world is undeniable. His vision of a new socialist society grounded in the ideals of Marxism inspired generations of revolutionaries. Yet his legacy is not without controversy. The revolution he led, and the system he helped create, became one of the most powerful and enduring political entities in modern history, but also one that would be marked by significant struggles, contradictions, and eventual transformation. Lenin's most immediate legacy was the establishment of the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist state. After years of struggle, revolution, and civil war, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, succeeded in overthrowing the Tsarist regime and dismantling the centuries-old autocracy that had ruled Russia. The Russian Empire was replaced by the Soviet Union, a state built on the principles of Marxism, Leninism, in which the working class was supposed to take control of the means of production, and the ruling class was to be eliminated. In the early years of the Soviet Union, Lenin's policies were aimed at stabilizing the country and consolidating the gains of the revolution. The new economic policy, NEP, introduced by Lenin in 1921, was a temporary measure to address the economic crisis left by the Civil War and the famine. The NEP allowed for some elements of capitalism, such as private trade and small businesses, to help revive the economy. While controversial, the NEP was successful in stabilizing the economy and improving living conditions, and it helped lay the foundation for the Soviet state's survival in the early years. Yet Lenin's vision for the future of the Soviet Union went beyond mere survival. He hoped to create a socialist society in which the workers and peasants would hold political and economic power. His ideal of a classless society free from exploitation and oppression was the foundation of the Soviet Union's ideological framework. Lenin's influence on Soviet policy and governance in these early years cannot be overstated, but his vision was also limited by the harsh realities of building a new state in a world dominated by capitalist powers. Lenin's ideological influence reached far beyond Russia. His ideas on revolutionary strategy, the role of the vanguard party, and the necessity of dictatorship of the proletariat shaped socialist movements worldwide. Leninism, a set of political and economic ideas derived from Marxism but adapted to the conditions of Russia, became a central ideology for communist movements in many countries. The Bolshevik model of revolution, with its emphasis on a disciplined, centralized party, would inspire other revolutions, particularly in China, Cuba, and Vietnam. The influence of Lenin's ideas can be seen in the rise of communist parties and revolutionary movements across the globe, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. Yet Lenin's legacy also became a point of contention. After his death, the Soviet Union underwent a period of internal struggle for power. The rise of Joseph Stalin and his eventual consolidation of power marked a dramatic shift away from Lenin's vision of collective leadership. Stalin's authoritarian style of governance, with his focus on centralized control and the use of terror to maintain power, diverged sharply from Lenin's original ideals. Lenin had envisioned a society where power was distributed more equitably, with a democratic collective leadership guiding the revolution. Stalin, on the other hand, centralized power in his own hands and used the state apparatus to purge those he saw as rivals. In his final years, Lenin had expressed concerns about Stalin's rise and the direction the revolution was taking. In his testament, Lenin criticized Stalin for his harsh methods and his concentration of power within the Communist Party. Lenin warned that Stalin's actions could jeopardize the future of the revolution, and urged the party to remove him from his position as General Secretary. However, Lenin's concerns were largely ignored, and Stalin's rise to power became one of the most significant developments in Soviet history. Stalin's policies, which included forced collectivization, mass purges, and widespread repression, were far removed from the ideals Lenin had espoused. Despite Stalin's dominance, Lenin's name and legacy remained central to the Soviet Union. Even after Stalin's death, Lenin's image was used as a symbol of the revolution and the struggle for socialism. Statues of Lenin were erected in cities across the Soviet Union, and his writings were studied in schools and universities. Lenin's body was embalmed and displayed in Red Square, serving as a constant reminder of his central role in the creation of the Soviet state. His image became a powerful tool for legitimating the Soviet government, even as it became increasingly disconnected from the revolutionary ideals he had fought for. In the years following Lenin's death, the Soviet Union underwent significant changes, particularly under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev and the Khrushchev thaw of the 1950s. During this period, there was a reassessment of Stalin's rule and a return to some of the ideals Lenin had championed, particularly in terms of collective leadership and a more democratic approach within the Communist Party. However, the legacy of Stalin's rule and the authoritarian state he had built loomed large, and the Soviet Union would continue to struggle with questions of leadership, power, and reform. Lenin's legacy is also viewed differently outside the Soviet Union. In the West, Lenin was both admired and vilified. To some, he was a visionary revolutionary who sought to overthrow the capitalist system and create a just society. To others, he was a dictator who, despite his initial ideals, established a system of one-party rule that would lead to the repression of political dissent. Lenin's revolutionary methods, including the use of violence to secure power and the suppression of political opposition, have been the subject of intense debate among historians, political theorists, and scholars. In the post-Soviet era, Lenin's legacy has been reassessed once again, particularly in Russia. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was a period of reflection on Lenin's role in the creation of the state and the events that followed. Some in Russia continue to view Lenin as a national hero, while others see him as the architect of a system that ultimately led to the repression and downfall of the Soviet Union. The debate over Lenin's legacy remains a deeply contentious issue in Russian politics and culture. Despite the controversies that surround his legacy, Lenin's impact on world history is undeniable. His leadership of the Russian Revolution, his contributions to Marxist theory, and his role in establishing the Soviet Union have made him one of the most important figures in modern history. Lenin's vision of a classless society, where the workers would have control over the means of production, inspired revolutionary movements around the world and laid the groundwork for the rise of socialism in the 20th century. Lenin's legacy, therefore, is multifaceted. It is one of profound achievement, the overthrow of an autocratic regime, the establishment of a new socialist state, and the spreading of revolutionary ideas across the globe. It is also a legacy of contradictions, of a revolution that sought to eliminate oppression and inequality, but that was marked by authoritarianism and repression. Lenin's impact on the Soviet Union and on world history remains a subject of intense debate, but his place in history is secure. The revolution he led and the state he helped create shaped the course of the 20th century and continues to influence political thought and practice today. Vladimir Lenin's impact transcended the borders of Russia and the Soviet Union. While his immediate focus had been the establishment of a socialist state in Russia, his ideas and the example of the Russian Revolution of 1917 became a beacon for revolutionary movements worldwide. Lenin's interpretation of Marxism, later known as Leninism, and his focus on the necessity of a disciplined, centralized party, left a lasting imprint on socialist and communist movements around the world. One of the most significant aspects of Lenin's legacy was his theory of revolution. He adapted Marxist theory to the Russian context, emphasizing the role of a professional revolutionary vanguard party that would lead the working class and peasantry in overthrowing the existing social order. Lenin believed that the revolution in Russia would not wait for the full development of capitalist society, as Marx had suggested in his theories. Instead, Lenin argued that the conditions in Russia, marked by the backwardness of capitalism, created the opportunity for an immediate socialist revolution, guided by a revolutionary party. This revolutionary approach did not remain confined to Russia. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had inspired revolutionary movements around the world. Lenin's theories on revolution, his strategies for insurrection, and his organizational principles were adopted by many who sought to overthrow oppressive regimes and replace them with socialist governments. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, Lenin's ideas spread through Europe and beyond. His call for workers' councils or Soviets inspired labor movements across the continent. Workers' councils, which had been central to the Russian Revolution, were seen as a means by which the working class could take direct control over production and political power. In countries such as Germany and Hungary, workers attempted to establish similar councils in the hope of mimicking the Russian model. While these revolutions were largely unsuccessful, the influence of Lenin's ideas on these movements was clear. One of the most significant movements inspired by Leninism was the Chinese Revolution. Lenin's model of revolutionary leadership and his emphasis on the role of a centralized party were closely followed by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Mao, like Lenin, believed in the necessity of a vanguard party to lead the revolution. Lenin's focus on peasant support, rather than purely urban working-class support, also resonated with Mao, as the majority of China's population was rural. Lenin's influence on Mao and the Chinese Communist Party was profound, and Mao's eventual rise to power in China would create one of the world's most significant communist states, founded on the principles of Leninism. Lenin's ideas also had a major impact in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese nationalist and communist movement, studied Lenin's works closely. Lenin's emphasis on the self-determination of oppressed nations and his approach to anti-imperialist struggles were central to Ho Chi Minh's thinking. Ho and his fellow revolutionaries in Vietnam drew inspiration from Lenin's successful mobilization of the masses, particularly his emphasis on uniting the working class, peasantry, and intellectuals in a common struggle against imperialism and feudalism. The success of the Vietnamese Revolution, particularly the defeat of French colonial forces, was in many ways a continuation of the path laid out by Lenin's ideas. In Cuba, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were also influenced by Lenin's revolutionary theory. While the Cuban Revolution was not a direct application of Leninist thought, Castro's ideas on revolutionary leadership and Guevara's focus on guerrilla warfare echoed the lessons of Lenin's revolution. Guevara, in particular, admired Lenin's ability to inspire and lead a disciplined revolutionary party. The Cuban Revolution of 1959, which ousted the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, was one of the most important success stories of the 20th century socialist revolutions, with Lenin's influence seen in both the ideological underpinnings and the methods used to secure victory. Lenin's influence extended even to countries in Latin America, such as Chile and Nicaragua, where socialist and communist movements adopted aspects of his revolutionary strategy. Lenin's writings on imperialism, revolution, and the role of the state were foundational for the development of the socialist movements in these regions, which were fighting against both domestic elites and foreign powers, particularly the United States. The impact of Lenin's ideas also extended to Africa, where many anti-colonial movements sought inspiration from his theories. Leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, and Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau looked to Lenin's writings on national liberation and anti-imperialism. Lenin's emphasis on the necessity of a revolutionary party, combined with his critique of imperialism, provided a blueprint for many African liberation movements seeking to free their nations from colonial rule and build new socialist societies. Even in Western Europe and the United States, Lenin's ideas continued to influence socialist and communist parties. While the Russian Revolution itself did not inspire successful revolutions in these regions, Lenin's focus on the importance of organization and revolutionary discipline shaped the strategies of communist parties in countries like France, Italy, and the UK. Lenin's ideas also had an impact on the Trotskyist movements, which split from the mainstream communist parties after the rise of Stalin. Leon Trotsky, once a close ally of Lenin, continued to advocate for international revolution and the spread of the socialist cause in ways that were grounded in Lenin's initial teachings, though he sharply criticized Stalin's rise to power. However, Lenin's legacy was not without its critics. Even within the socialist movement, there were debates about the nature of Lenin's revolution and the methods he employed to secure power. The use of violence, repression of political opposition, and the centralization of authority in the hands of the party raised questions about the relationship between revolutionary ideals and authoritarian practices. The dictatorship of the proletariat, which Lenin argued was necessary in the transition to socialism, often resulted in the consolidation of state power, and the Soviet system, particularly under Stalin, became a symbol of the dangers of authoritarian rule. Critics of Lenin and the Soviet Union argued that the revolution, while achieving significant social change, had compromised the very ideals of freedom and democracy it sought to establish. Despite these criticisms, Lenin's impact on the world's revolutionary movements cannot be overstated. His adaptation of Marxist theory to the specific conditions of Russia and his focus on the role of a vanguard party reshaped the global understanding of revolution. Lenin provided a roadmap for movements that sought to dismantle imperialism and capitalism and replace them with a new, socialist order. While his legacy is complex and contested, Lenin remains a towering figure in the history of revolutionary thought and practice. Vladimir Lenin's legacy remains one of the most debated and complex in modern history. To some, he is a heroic figure who liberated Russia from the tyranny of the Tsarist autocracy and created the world's first socialist state. To others, he is a symbol of authoritarianism and the betrayal of the very ideals of the revolution he helped lead. The revolution he sparked, the Soviet state he helped establish, and the methods he employed to achieve these ends have all left an indelible mark on world history. In retrospect, Lenin's legacy is multifaceted. On one hand, Lenin's leadership during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and his role in the creation of the Soviet Union cannot be denied. He succeeded in overthrowing the Tsarist regime, dismantling the centuries-old autocracy, and establishing the first state based on socialist principles. His vision for a classless society where the working class controlled the means of production provided a new ideological foundation for the future. Lenin believed that only through a revolution could the working class be freed from exploitation and oppression, and he acted with unwavering determination to make this vision a reality. Yet the means by which Lenin pursued his revolutionary aims often came into conflict with the ideals he espoused. While he advocated for a democratic society based on equality and freedom, his leadership was marked by a strict authoritarian approach. The need for a disciplined vanguard party, which Lenin saw as central to achieving revolution, often led to the centralization of power in the hands of a few. The Bolshevik Party, under Lenin's direction, employed tactics of suppression, censorship, and political repression to maintain control, particularly during the Russian Civil War. These methods were justified as necessary to protect the revolution from its enemies, but they also laid the groundwork for the authoritarian state that would follow. Lenin's legacy is complicated by his own contradictions. While he pushed for a classless society, his leadership often relied on class-based power structures within the party and state. The dictatorship of the proletariat, which Lenin promoted as a temporary necessity in the transition to socialism, ultimately became a mechanism of control and centralization. Despite his commitment to Marxist ideas, Lenin's practical actions sometimes diverged from the original goals of Marxism. His call for the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was initially seen as a step towards full worker control, gave rise to an entrenched state apparatus, one that would later be exploited by Stalin for personal gain and political repression. Lenin's views on governance and his relationship with the state evolved over time. Early in the revolution, he advocated for a broad-based revolution that would bring together workers, peasants, and intellectuals to transform society. He believed in the necessity of mass participation in the revolutionary process, and his focus on the Soviets, workers' councils, was central to his vision of a participatory socialist state. However, as the revolution progressed and Lenin faced opposition both from outside and within the Bolshevik Party, he increasingly focused on consolidating power in the hands of the Bolshevik leadership. The revolution's early ideals of worker control and decentralization began to give way to a more authoritarian approach, and Lenin's government began to prioritize the survival of the state over the promises of democratic governance. In hindsight, many scholars and critics point to Lenin's approach as a precursor to the Stalinist system of government, which would become synonymous with repression, mass purges, and centralized totalitarian rule. Stalin, Lenin's one-time ally, would later use the state apparatus Lenin helped build to maintain his own absolute control, leading to the horrors of the Great Terror. Lenin's failure to fully address the question of leadership succession, and his reluctance to take stronger action against the concentration of power within the party, left the Soviet Union vulnerable to Stalin's rise. However, it would be unfair to reduce Lenin's legacy to just the rise of Stalin. Lenin's revolution achieved significant social changes that affected millions of Russians. Under Lenin, the Soviet government took steps to dismantle the old social order. Land was redistributed to peasants, and the Soviet state took control of key industries in the economy. The revolution also led to the abolition of the old class-based hierarchy, and Lenin's government sought to give women more rights, including access to education and the right to divorce. These reforms were groundbreaking for the time, and they laid the foundation for later social changes in Soviet Russia. Internationally, Lenin's influence continued to grow. His adaptation of Marxist theory, known as Leninism, became the foundation for many communist movements across the globe. Lenin's model of a centralized vanguard party, the strategy of revolutionary action, and his emphasis on the importance of anti-imperialist struggle were all ideas that resonated with movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Lenin's role as the architect of the Russian Revolution placed him at the forefront of the global communist movement. Even after his death, Lenin's vision continued to inspire revolutions. from the Chinese Revolution to the Cuban Revolution, and his ideas provided a framework for socialist movements throughout the 20th century. Despite the global spread of Leninism, the consequences of his actions, especially in the context of Soviet history, have continued to raise difficult questions. While Lenin achieved remarkable success in creating a socialist state, the authoritarian measures he implemented in the early years of the revolution ultimately gave rise to the very forces of repression he had hoped to dismantle. Lenin's inability to establish a fully democratic socialist state and his failure to confront the centralization of power within the Bolshevik Party allowed authoritarianism to take root and, later, to flourish under Stalin. In Russia, Lenin's legacy remains both revered and contested. Statues of Lenin still stand in many Russian cities, and his image continues to be a symbol of the revolutionary spirit that shaped the country. However, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 prompted a re-evaluation of Lenin's role in Russian history. For some, he remains a symbol of national pride and revolutionary struggle, while for others, his legacy is tied to the oppression and authoritarianism that followed the revolution. Lenin's impact on the Soviet Union was undeniable, but his legacy is one of contradictions and complexities. He was a revolutionary who changed the course of history, yet his vision of a socialist society was never fully realized. Lenin was both a visionary and a pragmatist, a leader who fought for the working class but who ultimately allowed the state to centralize power in ways that contradicted his own ideals. As history has shown, Lenin's revolution did not bring about the utopia he had envisioned, but it did leave a lasting imprint on the world, shaping the course of the 20th century in ways that continue to be felt today. Vladimir Lenin's influence, while lasting, was ultimately shaped by the paradoxes and contradictions within both his leadership and the revolution he spearheaded. By the time of his death in 1924, Lenin had accomplished much: the overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy, the establishment of the first socialist state, and the implementation of Marxist-Leninist policies that would shape the Soviet Union for decades. However, the reality of the Soviet Union he left behind was a far cry from the idealistic vision of socialism he had once imagined. His later years of illness, his inability to ensure a smooth leadership transition, and the rise of authoritarianism mark the end of an era, one in which Lenin's personal influence on Soviet life and the direction of global socialism was in its final stages. Despite the turmoil of his last years, Lenin remained steadfast in his commitment to the revolutionary cause. But by the time he passed, a new and troubling reality was emerging within the Soviet government. Lenin had always believed in the necessity of collective leadership and in the importance of a decentralized system of governance. However, his inability to rein in the increasing power of Joseph Stalin signified a dangerous shift in the leadership of the Communist Party. Lenin had expressed concerns about Stalin's growing influence and his methods of leadership in his testament, but his weakening health prevented him from taking action to address the emerging power struggle within the party. Lenin's death, in January 1924, heralded the end of his direct influence over Soviet affairs and the start of a new phase in Soviet history. The vacuum left by Lenin's passing quickly became apparent. While Lenin's legacy of revolution and socialism was still fresh, the political environment was changing rapidly. Stalin, who had carefully maneuvered his way into a position of power, was already beginning to consolidate his control over the party apparatus. By the time Stalin officially took full control in the late 1920s, he had largely neutralized the opposition, including Leon Trotsky, Lenin's one-time ally and rival, who was eventually exiled and later assassinated. The transition of power marked a dramatic shift away from the original ideals of the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin's vision of a collective leadership grounded in democratic centralism was increasingly replaced by a centralized one-man rule under Stalin. The Stalinist regime, while maintaining many of the outward symbols of Lenin's revolution, took on an increasingly authoritarian and repressive nature. Stalin's methods of control, which included purges, forced collectivization, and widespread terror, were far removed from the ideals of liberty and worker empowerment that had been central to Lenin's early policies. Stalin's rise to power created a distorted version of Leninism. While Lenin had promoted the idea of a strong party leadership, he had never envisioned a single leader with absolute authority. Under Stalin, the state apparatus became increasingly bureaucratic, centralized and controlled by a single figure. Lenin's calls for the participation of the workers and peasants in decision-making were replaced by a top-down system in which Stalin dictated policy and sought to eliminate any potential rivals. This divergence from Lenin's ideals would leave a legacy of repression and totalitarianism that defined the Soviet Union for much of the 20th century. Despite these dramatic shifts, Lenin's influence was not entirely erased. The very system Stalin had inherited, along with the state's official ideology, was rooted in Lenin's ideas. Stalin would later seek to legitimize his rule by invoking Lenin's name, portraying himself as the rightful successor to the revolutionary cause. Lenin's image would be used by Stalin to strengthen the cult of personality around the leader, creating a narrative that portrayed the Soviet Union as continuing Lenin's work, even as Stalin's actions increasingly contradicted the democratic and egalitarian principles Lenin had once espoused. After Lenin's death, the Soviet Union began to embrace the idea of Leninism, a version of Marxism adapted to the Russian context, but increasingly tied to the personality cult of Stalin. Lenin's name became a symbol, a reminder of the revolution and the promises of a just society, even as the Soviet government became a brutal instrument of control. The reinterpretation of Lenin's legacy under Stalin was part of a broader effort to consolidate power and secure legitimacy for the new Soviet state. Statues of Lenin were erected across the Soviet Union, and his writings became essential reading for party members. Yet Stalin's regime would leave a bitter mark on the revolutionary ideals Lenin had fought for. In the decades that followed, Lenin's role in Soviet history would continue to be reassessed, particularly as the Soviet Union evolved through periods of reform and stagnation. The Khrushchev thaw in the 1950s, following the death of Stalin, brought a period of re-evaluation of Stalin's legacy and, by extension, Lenin's role. Nikita Khrushchev denounced the cult of personality surrounding Stalin and the excesses of his reign. This opened the door for a more nuanced understanding of Lenin's legacy, including the acknowledgement that Lenin's policies were not without flaws. Khrushchev's policies of de-Stalinization also brought about some reconsideration of Lenin's more democratic ideals, as the Soviet government sought to distance itself from the extremes of Stalin's reign. However, Lenin's legacy would never be fully separated from Stalin's. In the public mind, Lenin remained the symbol of the revolution, even as the Soviet system became more oppressive under Stalin. His image continued to be revered in Soviet propaganda, though the system that he helped establish had long deviated from the revolutionary ideals he had once promoted. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the re-evaluation of Lenin's legacy took on even greater significance. In the post-Soviet era, Lenin's role in Russian history became a deeply political issue. In Russia, Lenin was seen by some as a hero, a man who had transformed the country and given birth to a new era. To others, particularly those who suffered under the repressive Soviet state, Lenin's legacy was inseparable from the authoritarianism that followed. Statues of Lenin were removed from many Russian cities, while in others, they remained as symbols of a lost era. Today, Lenin remains a figure of complex and contradictory legacy. His contributions to revolutionary thought, his role in the overthrow of Tsarism, and his establishment of the Soviet Union continue to be recognized as monumental achievements in world history. However, the authoritarianism that developed in the wake of his revolution, particularly under Stalin, has complicated his legacy. Lenin's ideals were distorted by the very system he created, and his inability to address the dangers of centralized power contributed to the rise of one of the most oppressive regimes in history. Lenin's legacy is one that continues to provoke debate, both in Russia and across the world. His vision of a socialist society based on the equality of all people remains an inspiration for many revolutionary movements, while his methods, and the authoritarian state that emerged after his death, remain a cautionary tale of the potential dangers of concentrated power. The end of Lenin's era did not mark the end of his influence. Instead, it marked the beginning of a broader, ongoing reflection on the complexities and contradictions of revolution and the quest for a better society. Vladimir Lenin's intellectual journey and the ideological evolution of Leninism reflect the way in which his thoughts on revolution, socialism, and the state developed over the course of his life. Lenin was not merely a disciple of Marxism, he was its most influential interpreter, adapting Marx's ideas to the specific conditions of Russia and the broader global political landscape. Lenin's evolving understanding of Marxism and how to bring it to life defined the revolutionary movement that transformed Russia in 1917 and influenced countless movements worldwide. At its core, Leninism was a radical expansion and adaptation of Marxism for a revolutionary state in Russia. Marx's theories, especially his focus on class struggle and the inevitability of capitalism's collapse, were adapted by Lenin to fit the unique political and social conditions of Russia, which was still a predominantly agrarian society, not yet fully industrialized. Lenin argued that the revolution could not wait for the full development of capitalism. Instead, he advocated for a rupture, a break from the existing social order, using the working class and peasants to seize power through a socialist revolution, bypassing some of the stages Marx had envisioned. This shift marked the first major ideological contribution of Lenin to Marxism, the concept of the vanguard party. Lenin believed that in Russia, where the working class was not yet large enough or organized enough to lead a successful revolution on its own, a small, disciplined party of professional revolutionaries would need to lead the workers, guide the revolution, and organize the masses into action. This vanguard would not only lead the revolution, but would ensure that the revolution could be sustained after power had been seized. Lenin's focus on the need for a central organized party was in direct contrast to the more spontaneous and less centralized revolutionary strategies of other socialist groups, particularly the Mensheviks. Lenin's theoretical evolution also took a crucial turn when he addressed the issue of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx had believed that once the working class had overthrown the capitalist system, the state would gradually wither away as class distinctions were erased. Lenin, however, saw the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary and protracted process. He argued that after the revolution, the working class would need to continue exercising control over the state to prevent counter-revolutionary forces from regaining power. While the state's eventual disappearance was still a part of Lenin's vision, he realized that the immediate need was to consolidate power and defend the revolution against both internal and external enemies. The Russian Revolution of 1917, which saw the fall of Tsar Nicholas II and the rise of Bolshevik power, became the laboratory for Lenin's theories. When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control, their first priority was consolidating power and ensuring the revolution's survival. This meant they had to address the realities of governance, establishing authority, dealing with counter-revolutionary forces, and organizing the economy. Lenin and his comrades began implementing nationalization of industries, land redistribution, and sweeping political changes in line with their socialist agenda. These steps mark the beginning of the Soviet state, which, under Lenin's leadership, would be based on a centralized planned economy. However, the way Lenin implemented these policies, and how he justified their necessity, shifted as he dealt with practical difficulties. In his early writings, Lenin had argued for a quick, radical transition to socialism, believing that the proletariat would immediately take power and that the economic transition would follow suit. But as the revolution unfolded, Lenin was forced to reconsider his earlier positions. The economic conditions of Russia, combined with the devastating effects of World War I, meant that the Bolsheviks could not immediately implement the ideals of socialism. The war and famine had drained the resources of the country, and the Bolshevik government struggled to provide basic needs, let alone begin the transition to socialism on the scale they had envisioned. In response to this reality, Lenin introduced the New Economic Policy, NEP, in 1921, which marked a pragmatic shift in Bolshevik policy. The NEP temporarily allowed for some degree of private enterprise and market mechanisms, such as small-scale trade and peasant farming, in order to stabilize the economy and rebuild after the Civil War. The policy was a departure from Lenin's earlier, more radical positions, but he justified it as a necessary measure to keep the revolution alive in the face of economic collapse. The NEP was a tactical retreat, and Lenin's acceptance of this shift highlighted his flexibility in adapting Marxist principles to the material conditions of the time. In his later years, as Lenin's health deteriorated and the political struggles within the Bolshevik Party intensified, Lenin's thoughts turned increasingly toward the broader future of the revolution. He grew concerned about the centralization of power and the growing influence of Stalin within the party. Lenin had always supported the idea of a disciplined party and the necessity of centralized leadership in the early stages of revolution, but he increasingly worried about the concentration of power in one individual's hands. His critique of Stalin, made public in his final writings and his testament, was a stark warning about the dangers of authoritarianism within the Bolshevik Party and the need to ensure collective leadership to preserve the revolution. The ideological evolution of Leninism after Lenin's death was shaped by the tension between his vision for a democratic socialist society and the authoritarian realities that followed. Stalin, who had consolidated power after Lenin's death, would reinterpret Lenin's ideas to fit his own vision of centralized control. Lenin's emphasis on a vanguard party and state authority was retained, but Stalin took these ideas to an extreme, consolidating power and centralizing authority to an extent that would have likely alarmed Lenin had he lived to see it. Lenin's legacy, therefore, is one of both transformation and contradiction. While his vision for a socialist future was grounded in Marxist principles of equality and the empowerment of the working class, the methods he employed to secure the revolution often contradicted those very principles. Leninism, the theoretical framework he developed, would inspire revolutionary movements across the globe, but the interpretation of those ideas and the way they were put into practice would vary widely. In the Soviet Union, Lenin's revolutionary fervor gave way to a more centralized authoritarian form of governance under Stalin, but his ideas continued to shape the political landscape for decades. The ideological evolution of Leninism is a reminder of the difficulty in translating revolutionary ideals into reality. While Lenin's theoretical contributions remain a foundation for Marxist thought, the practical realities of building a new society often led to compromises, contradictions, and, ultimately, authoritarian outcomes. Lenin's theories, while a response to the specific conditions of early 20th century Russia, continue to resonate with revolutionary movements, though his legacy is a complicated one, marked by both the successes of the revolution he led and the failures of the system that followed. Lenin's revolutionary vision was born out of a deep commitment to the ideals of socialism and the belief that the working class, once liberated from capitalist oppression, could create a new world founded on equality, justice, and freedom. However, as the revolution unfolded and Lenin found himself at the helm of the newly established Soviet state, the challenges of translating revolutionary ideals into practical governance began to reveal themselves. The question of how to achieve the revolution's goals while navigating the harsh realities of war, famine, and political opposition became central to Lenin's leadership and to the history of the Soviet Union. At the heart of Lenin's approach to revolution was his belief in the necessity of a vanguard party, a disciplined and centralized organization of professional revolutionaries who could lead the working class to power. This concept of a vanguard party was essential to Lenin's understanding of Marxism. While Marx had envisioned a spontaneous uprising of the working class to overthrow the capitalist system, Lenin saw the Russian context as one where the working class was too small and insufficiently organized to lead the revolution on its own. Thus, Lenin argued, the revolution had to be led by a small group of committed intellectuals and revolutionaries who would guide the masses toward a socialist future. In practice, this vision led to a party structure that was highly centralized and hierarchical, with a small elite at the top guiding the revolution. While Lenin justified this approach as necessary for the survival of the revolution, the realities of wielding such centralized power led to significant contradictions. Lenin's belief in the dictatorship of the proletariat, the temporary necessity of a powerful state that would defend the revolution from both internal and external enemies, gave way to a political system in which the party, rather than the workers or peasants, became the central authority. Over time, the centralization of power within the Bolshevik Party began to undermine the democratic ideals of the revolution. Lenin's early vision for the revolution was one of widespread participation. The Soviets, or workers' councils, which were central to the Russian Revolution, were meant to be the primary organs of political power, giving the people direct control over their governance. Lenin, in his idealistic moments, envisioned a system where power was decentralized and decisions were made by the workers and peasants themselves. However, as the revolution progressed, these democratic ideals were undermined by the practical need for swift decision-making in the midst of war and unrest. The Bolshevik government increasingly relied on the central authority of the Communist Party, leaving the Soviets with limited power. One of the major contradictions that Lenin faced was the tension between his commitment to Marxist principles and the authoritarian measures he took to ensure the survival of the revolution. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, often used violence, repression, and coercion to maintain control, particularly during the Russian Civil War. The Red Terror, initiated by the Bolsheviks in 1918, was a brutal campaign to eliminate opposition, both from outside and within the party. While Lenin justified these actions as necessary to protect the revolution from counter-revolutionary forces, they marked a significant departure from the more democratic principles Lenin had initially espoused. This use of force to secure the revolution presented a fundamental dilemma for Lenin. On one hand, he believed in the necessity of an authoritarian state to defend the revolution, especially in a country as vast and politically fractured as Russia. On the other hand, the revolution's original goals, the empowerment of the working class, the elimination of the state, and the creation of a society based on equality, seemed increasingly distant as the Bolshevik government became more centralized and authoritarian. Lenin's personal writings and speeches reveal his awareness of this contradiction. In his later years, he expressed concerns about the centralization of power and the concentration of authority in the hands of a few, particularly as Stalin's influence within the party grew. The revolution, in Lenin's eyes, was meant to be the first stage of a broader international socialist movement. He saw the Russian Revolution as a spark that would ignite a series of revolutions across Europe, eventually leading to a global socialist transformation. However, the international spread of revolution did not materialize as Lenin had hoped. The failure of the German Revolution in 1918 and the inability of other European socialist movements to overthrow their capitalist governments left the Soviet Union isolated. This isolation, coupled with the continued economic difficulties and political instability in Russia, meant that the Bolsheviks had to prioritize the consolidation of power within the country rather than the international spread of revolution. As the Bolsheviks solidified their control over Russia, the ideological purity of the revolution began to erode. Lenin's vision of a classless society governed by the people gave way to the reality of a state-controlled society led by a party elite. This evolution of the revolution, from the ideals of Marxism to the bureaucratic and authoritarian state under Lenin, marked the beginning of the tensions that would come to define the Soviet Union in the decades that followed. Lenin's revolutionary government was increasingly at odds with the democratic ideals that had inspired the revolution in the first place. Another key issue Lenin grappled with was the question of war communism. In the early years of Bolshevik rule, Russia was embroiled in the chaos of civil war. The country was facing not only the threat of internal enemies, but also foreign intervention. In this context, Lenin implemented war communism, a set of policies aimed at nationalizing the economy, centralizing control, and requisitioning supplies to support the Red Army. War communism was a necessary response to the exigencies of the Civil War, but it had significant negative consequences, particularly for the peasantry. Forced grain requisitioning and other measures led to widespread famine and resentment among the rural population. Lenin's decision to introduce the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921 was an acknowledgement of the failure of war communism and the need for economic pragmatism. The NEP allowed for limited private enterprise and market mechanisms to help stabilize the economy, but it also represented a retreat from the more radical aspects of the revolution. Lenin's acceptance of these compromises highlighted the tension between the ideals of the revolution and the harsh realities of governing a war-torn country. Ultimately, Lenin's revolutionary journey was marked by the struggle to reconcile his vision of a just, classless society with the brutal and often contradictory realities of revolution. While he remained steadfast in his commitment to socialism and the working class, his methods, including the centralization of power and the use of force to achieve and maintain control, often undermined the very ideals he sought to uphold. Lenin's revolution was a deeply transformative event, but it was also one that was shaped by the complexities of realpolitik, economic necessity, and the need for survival in a world of competing powers. The contradictions within Lenin's vision, the tension between democracy and authoritarianism, between idealism and pragmatism, continued to shape the Soviet Union after his death. While Lenin laid the groundwork for a new socialist society, the system he helped create would evolve into one marked by a concentration of power, centralization, and political repression, particularly under Stalin. Lenin's legacy, therefore, remains a subject of intense debate as his revolution and its outcomes continue to shape the course of history. Vladimir Lenin's revolutionary ideas were not confined to Russia alone. While his ultimate goal was the establishment of a socialist state within the borders of Russia, he always saw the revolution as part of a broader international movement. Lenin's vision was one of global socialist transformation, a movement that would not only overthrow the Tsarist autocracy, but also challenge imperialism and capitalism on a global scale. His efforts to spread the revolutionary cause beyond Russia would have lasting consequences for both the Soviet Union and the broader socialist movement worldwide. One of Lenin's key contributions to the international socialist movement was his adaptation of Marxist theory to the specific conditions of Russia, which later came to be known as Leninism. While Marx had envisioned that the revolution would take place in industrialized capitalist countries, Lenin argued that a revolution could happen in a less industrialized country like Russia, where the working class was small and the peasantry was still a dominant force. Lenin believed that the Russian Revolution could act as a catalyst for revolutions in other countries, particularly in Europe, Thus, the success of the Russian Revolution was, in Lenin's eyes, not just a national project but part of a global struggle for socialism. Lenin's call for worldwide revolution was grounded in his belief that imperialism, the domination of weaker countries by stronger capitalist powers, was a central feature of modern capitalism. Lenin's famous work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1917, argued that the exploitation of colonies and the expansion of capitalist powers were integral to the functioning of capitalism in its imperialist phase. He viewed the struggle for national liberation in colonized countries as intertwined with the global struggle for socialism. Lenin argued that only through global revolution could the capitalist system be overthrown and replaced with socialism. One of the ways Lenin sought to spread revolutionary ideas beyond Russia was through the Comintern, or the Third International, which he founded in 1919. The Comintern was designed to promote and organize revolutions in other countries, working in solidarity with socialist parties and revolutionary movements around the world. It aimed to unite workers, peasants, and revolutionaries in a common struggle against imperialism and capitalism, with the ultimate goal of establishing a worldwide socialist society. The Comintern's influence was particularly strong in Europe, where communist movements were already gaining traction. The Russian Revolution had inspired workers and socialists across the continent, many of whom saw the Bolsheviks as their comrades in arms. Lenin hoped that the success of the Russian Revolution would spark similar uprisings in countries like Germany, France, and Italy, where discontent with capitalism and the aftermath of World War I had created a fertile ground for revolution. In Germany, the Spartacist uprising of 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was inspired by the Bolshevik example, though it was crushed by the German government. Similarly, communist movements in other European countries such as Hungary attempted to seize power, but the revolutionary wave Lenin envisioned did not materialize in the way he had hoped. Lenin's vision of a global socialist revolution faced significant obstacles. The Russian Revolution, while successful, had not been followed by the kind of widespread international uprisings that Lenin had anticipated. One of the main reasons for this was the failure of the European socialist parties to embrace revolution. In Germany, the social democratic government that took power after the defeat of the Kaiser's regime, though initially supportive of socialist principles, ultimately sought to preserve the capitalist system. The failure of the German revolutionaries to seize power in the wake of World War I was a major blow to Lenin's hopes for an international revolution. Lenin's focus on international revolution also had significant implications for the Soviet Union. The early years of the Soviet state were marked by both internal and external challenges. The country was devastated by the Civil War, foreign intervention, and the economic devastation of World War I. Lenin had hoped for the spread of revolution in Europe to provide support for the Soviet state, but as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that Russia would have to survive on its own. The new economic policy, NEP, introduced by Lenin in 1921, reflected this shift in focus, as it was a pragmatic attempt to stabilize the Soviet economy, rather than continuing the more radical policies of war communism. The failure of international revolution meant that the Soviet Union would have to build socialism in one country, a policy that would later become a cornerstone of Stalin's rule. Lenin's failure to spark widespread revolutions outside Russia did not, however, negate the significance of the Russian Revolution for the international socialist movement. The Soviet Union, under Lenin, became the world's first socialist state and a symbol of the possibility of building a new society. Lenin's leadership of the Bolshevik Party and the Russian Revolution showed that revolution was possible, even in a country that was not yet industrialized, and it gave hope to socialist movements around the world. The Russian Revolution provided a model for other revolutionary movements, particularly in colonized nations, where the struggle for independence and the struggle for socialism became intertwined. In the decades following Lenin's death, his ideas continued to shape the global socialist movement. After the Bolshevik seizure of power, the Soviet Union became the epicenter of global socialism, with Leninism providing the ideological framework for the international communist movement. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Comintern sought to promote revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where anti-imperialist struggles were growing in strength. Lenin's emphasis on the interconnectedness of imperialism and capitalism influenced socialist leaders in countries such as China, Vietnam, and Cuba, who saw their struggles as part of the larger global movement for socialism. In China, Mao Zedong adapted Lenin's ideas about revolution, particularly the role of the peasantry in the struggle for power. Lenin's belief that socialism could be achieved in countries that were not yet fully industrialized resonated with Mao, whose focus on rural peasants in China mirrored Lenin's tactics in Russia. The Chinese Revolution, which eventually led to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, was heavily influenced by Lenin's ideas, though it was also shaped by the unique conditions in China. Lenin's influence was also felt in Cuba, where Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led a successful revolution in 1959. Like Lenin, Castro and Guevara were inspired by the idea of a vanguard party leading the revolution, and they saw their struggle as part of a broader movement to dismantle imperialism and capitalism. Cuba's success, along with the influence of Soviet support, demonstrated the continuing relevance of Lenin's revolutionary ideas even in the second half of the 20th century. Lenin's vision of international revolution, while not fully realized in his lifetime, continued to shape global revolutionary movements for decades. His focus on the need for a disciplined vanguard party, his emphasis on anti-imperialism, and his strategic understanding of revolution influenced movements in both industrialized and colonized nations. While the failure of the Russian Revolution to inspire widespread revolutions in Europe was a blow to Lenin's hopes, the legacy of his revolutionary leadership and his vision of a global socialist future endured, leaving a lasting imprint on the history of socialism and revolutionary movements worldwide. Lenin's path to revolution was not only shaped by his political ideology, but also by the strategic choices he made to transform theory into practice. His leadership during the Russian Revolution of 1917 and in the early years of the Soviet state involved navigating a complex landscape of competing ideas, changing circumstances, and unexpected challenges. While Lenin's theoretical framework was rooted in Marxism, his revolutionary tactics were deeply pragmatic, shaped by the need to seize and consolidate power in an environment of crisis and instability. One of the key aspects of Lenin's revolutionary tactics was his ability to adapt Marxist theory to the specific political and social conditions of Russia. Marxism, as originally articulated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, was a theory of class struggle aimed at the working class overthrowing the capitalist system. Marx had expected that revolution would first occur in industrialized capitalist countries, where the proletariat would have a large and organized presence. However, Russia was an agrarian empire with a relatively small working class. Lenin, recognizing these differences, adapted Marxist theory to the Russian context by focusing not only on the urban proletariat, but also on the rural peasantry, a key group that Marx had largely ignored. Lenin's approach to revolution was also shaped by the specific historical moment he faced. The February Revolution of 1917, which ousted Tsar Nicholas II, created an opening for revolutionary change, but it also brought with it a new set of challenges. The provisional government, formed after the Tsar's abdication, was weak and divided, and it continued to fight in World War I, which remained deeply unpopular. Lenin, always acutely aware of the political landscape, understood that the provisional government lacked both legitimacy and the ability to address the needs of the people. This situation provided an opportunity for the Bolsheviks under Lenin's leadership to seize power. Lenin's revolutionary tactics involved both seizing the moment and building mass support. He argued that the revolution needed to be led by the most advanced elements of the working class, but also emphasized the need to unite the masses, including soldiers, peasants, and workers, around the goal of overturning the existing order. In his famous April theses, Lenin called for a radical break from the provisional government and argued that power should be transferred directly to the Soviets, workers' councils, which had been established in the wake of the February Revolution. Lenin's call for an immediate socialist revolution, instead of waiting for a gradual process of capitalist development, was a bold tactical move. It was based on his belief that the conditions were ripe for revolution, and that delaying action would only allow the provisional government to regain control. At the same time, Lenin's strategy was grounded in his understanding of dual power. The provisional government and the Soviets represented two competing centers of authority. Lenin understood that the provisional government could not hold on to power indefinitely, and that the Soviets, despite their potential for revolutionary action, lacked the cohesion and leadership needed to take control. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party capitalized on the growing dissatisfaction with the war and the government's inability to address the needs of the workers and peasants. The Bolsheviks positioned themselves as the party of change, focusing on land reform, an end to Russia's involvement in the war, and the transfer of power to the Soviets. Their promise of peace, land, and bread resonated with the masses, giving the Bolsheviks the support they needed to seize power in the October Revolution of 1917. The Bolshevik seizure of power, often portrayed as a relatively quick and decisive event, was in reality the result of careful planning, opportunism, and timing. Lenin's understanding of power dynamics, both within the Bolshevik Party and in the broader political landscape, allowed him to guide the revolution to its ultimate success. He knew that to secure the revolution, it would be necessary to act quickly, decisively, and with the full backing of the people. His leadership in orchestrating the overthrow of the provisional government, which culminated in the storming of the Winter Palace in Petrograd, was a testament to his ability to mobilize both his party and the masses for the cause of revolution. However, once the Bolsheviks had seized power, Lenin was faced with new challenges that required further tactical adjustments. While the initial revolution had been driven by the momentum of the masses, consolidating power and establishing a stable government was another matter entirely. Lenin and the Bolsheviks quickly realized that the Russian state was in disarray, the economy was on the brink of collapse, and they were facing immediate threats from counter-revolutionary forces both within and outside the country. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, which followed the revolution, would test the strength of the Bolshevik state and Lenin's ability to preserve the revolution. The tactics Lenin employed during the Civil War were marked by ruthless pragmatism. The Bolsheviks used the Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, to fight off both White Army forces, counter-revolutionaries, and foreign interventions. The war was brutal, and the Bolsheviks resorted to harsh measures to suppress opposition. The Red Terror, initiated in 1918, was a campaign of violence and repression, aimed at eliminating enemies of the revolution, including both real and perceived political foes. While Lenin justified the use of terror as a necessary means of defending the revolution, this approach highlighted the tension between his revolutionary ideals and the brutal methods of state power that were being employed. Lenin's tactics during the Civil War also involved strategic use of alliances. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in 1918, ended Russia's involvement in World War I, but came at a great cost, as the treaty ceded large territories to the Central Powers. While this move was highly controversial and seen as a betrayal by some in the party, Lenin saw it as a necessary step to consolidate Bolshevik power and secure peace, which would allow the revolution to survive. The decision reflected Lenin's pragmatism as he recognized that internal survival took precedence over the broader international revolutionary goals, at least in the short term. Once the Bolsheviks had solidified their power, Lenin shifted his focus to rebuilding the economy and dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War. The introduction of the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921, which allowed for some degree of private enterprise and market activity, was a tactical move designed to stabilize the economy. While this policy was at odds with the more radical aspects of Lenin's earlier vision, he recognized that economic pragmatism was necessary to secure the revolution's survival. Lenin's revolutionary tactics, therefore, were marked by a continual balance between his ideals and the necessity of adapting to the situation at hand. His belief in the vanguard party, the necessity of a dictatorship of the proletariat, and the need for revolutionary violence were grounded in a deep commitment to the socialist cause. Yet, as he faced the challenges of governance, war, and economic collapse, Lenin showed remarkable flexibility, adjusting his tactics and policies to preserve the revolution and ensure its survival. Vladimir Lenin's role in the creation of the Soviet system was pivotal, not only in the establishment of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, in 1917, but also in laying the foundation for the Soviet Union that would officially take shape in 1922. Lenin's vision for a socialist state driven by the working class and managed by the vanguard party was deeply influential in shaping the political and economic system of the Soviet Union. However, the realities of implementing these ideals proved to be more complex, and Lenin's leadership was characterized by significant compromises and adaptations in the face of both internal and external challenges. Upon taking power in the wake of the October Revolution of 1917, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party immediately set about dismantling the existing state apparatus and creating a new order. The Bolsheviks abolished the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the Russian imperial bureaucracy. They also dismantled the provisional government, which had taken over after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. Lenin, guided by Marxist theory, believed that the state should be controlled by the working class, organized through workers' councils known as Soviets. For Lenin, the Soviets represented the true expression of workers' power, and he pushed for their central role in the new government. However, Lenin's vision of workers' control was complicated by the realities of governance in a war-torn, economically devastated country. The old Russian state, with its complex bureaucratic machinery, had left behind a deep power vacuum. Lenin's government, initially relying on the Soviets, struggled to maintain effective control over the vast and decentralized country. In practice, the Soviets lacked the resources, unity, and experience to function as the primary governing body. Consequently, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were forced to centralize power within the Communist Party, particularly after the Civil War broke out and the country faced immense external and internal threats. The centralization of power within the Bolshevik Party, led by Lenin, marked the beginning of a new system. Democratic centralism, a doctrine that emphasized the need for centralized decision-making within the Communist Party, while still allowing for some discussion and debate within the party ranks. While Lenin argued that the decisions of the central leadership must be adhered to by all members, democratic centralism was supposed to prevent the kind of bureaucratic despotism that could lead to authoritarian rule. However, this system in practice led to the increasing concentration of power in the hands of Lenin and his closest allies. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, played a crucial role in shaping the early Soviet system. The Bolsheviks were engaged in a brutal struggle against the White Army, counter-revolutionary forces, and foreign interventionists who sought to undo the revolution. The war devastated the country and brought harsh conditions that required rapid, centralized decision-making. Lenin, along with military leader Leon Trotsky, recognized that the survival of the revolution depended on the ability to maintain strict control over the state and its resources. This period saw the implementation of war communism, which involved the nationalization of industry, the requisitioning of grain from peasants, and the suppression of political opposition. War communism was essential for the survival of the Bolshevik government in the short term, but it also led to severe economic hardships, including widespread famine, discontent, and resentment from the peasantry. While war communism was initially justified as a temporary emergency measure to ensure the revolution's survival, it ultimately undermined the Bolsheviks' efforts to create a stable, productive economy. Lenin's response to these challenges was pragmatic, and in 1921 he introduced the New Economic Policy, NEP, which allowed for limited market activities, including private trade, small-scale private businesses, and agricultural production. The NEP marked a significant shift in Lenin's approach to economic management, as it reintroduced some aspects of capitalism into the Soviet economy to rebuild and stabilize the country after the devastation of the Civil War. The policy was controversial within the Communist Party, with many on the left criticizing it as a betrayal of socialist principles. However, Lenin defended the NEP as a necessary step to preserve the revolution and ensure its survival. The policy helped stabilize the economy, alleviated some of the harsh conditions caused by war communism, and allowed the Soviet Union to recover from the Civil War. However, Lenin's acceptance of market mechanisms under the NEP also raised fundamental questions about the long-term direction of the revolution. Despite the success of the NEP in stabilizing the Soviet economy, the early Soviet state faced serious challenges. Lenin's vision for the future of the Soviet Union was one of international socialism, but the failure of revolutions in Western Europe left the Soviet Union isolated. Lenin had hoped that the Russian Revolution would spark a wave of socialist revolutions across Europe, particularly in Germany and France, but those revolutions failed to materialize. As a result, the Soviet Union was forced to develop socialism in one country, a policy that would later be popularized by Joseph Stalin. Lenin's leadership in the early years of the Soviet state laid the groundwork for many of the structures that would define the Soviet system. Under Lenin, the Cheka, secret police, was established to suppress political opposition and maintain internal order. Lenin also oversaw the creation of the Red Army, which played a decisive role in the Civil War. The consolidation of Bolshevik power was also marked by the suppression of competing socialist factions, including the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, and other left-wing groups that opposed Lenin's authoritarian tactics. Lenin's role in the creation of the Soviet system also involved a major shift in the relationship between the Communist Party and the state. While Lenin initially envisioned a more democratic, decentralized system of governance, the realities of war and internal instability forced him to prioritize the survival of the revolution. The Bolshevik Party, under Lenin's leadership, became the central institution of power, with Lenin himself emerging as the undisputed leader. The Soviet state, with its centralized economy, one-party rule, and strong state apparatus, began to take shape during Lenin's rule. Lenin's contribution to the creation of the Soviet system was crucial, but it was also marked by contradictions. The centralized authoritarian methods used to secure the revolution and maintain power were at odds with the democratic ideals that had inspired the Bolshevik movement. While Lenin was committed to the idea of a workers' state, he increasingly turned to state control and bureaucratic structures to manage the country, resulting in a system that, in many ways, resembled the authoritarianism he had sought to overthrow. Lenin's health began to decline in the early 1920s, and by the time of his death in 1924 the Soviet system was firmly in place, though still fragile. The Soviet Union would continue to evolve, particularly under Joseph Stalin, who would build upon Lenin's foundations but also depart from some of Lenin's earlier ideals. Lenin's legacy, therefore, was one of profound transformation, but also one of unfulfilled aspirations and complex contradictions. His role in the creation of the Soviet system set the stage for the developments that would follow. But the direction the Soviet Union took after his death was a matter of intense ideological debate. One of the key themes of Lenin's leadership and his contribution to Marxist theory was his complex and evolving understanding of the role of the state in the transition to socialism. While Karl Marx had argued that the state, as an instrument of class oppression, would eventually wither away once the proletariat had taken power, Lenin's experience of revolution and governance led him to interpret the state's role in a much more nuanced and practical manner. Lenin agreed with Marx that capitalism created the conditions for the working class to rise up and overthrow the existing order. However, Lenin diverged from Marx in his understanding of the nature of the state during the transition to socialism. In Marx's original conception, once the proletariat had seized power and overthrown the bourgeoisie, the state would no longer be necessary. The working class would govern without the need for a state apparatus, as class distinctions would have been abolished. But Lenin, confronted with the immediate challenges of revolution in a largely agrarian society and a war-torn state, recognized that this vision of the state withering away was not immediately feasible. The Russian Revolution of 1917 marked the beginning of the Soviet experiment, but Lenin's leadership was shaped by a pragmatic understanding of the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat, a temporary phase during which the working class, guided by the Communist Party, would govern and suppress any counter-revolutionary forces. Lenin's formulation of this idea was in direct response to the fact that, even after overthrowing the Tsarist autocracy, the new Bolshevik government faced significant opposition. Both internal counter-revolutionary forces and external imperialist threats posed existential challenges to the fledgling socialist state. In his writings, Lenin famously argued that the state would not simply wither away immediately. Instead, he believed that the state would evolve, becoming a transitional state, which would exist as a necessary institution during the period between capitalism and full socialism. In his State and Revolution, 1917, Lenin emphasized that the workers, after seizing power, would use the state to suppress the bourgeoisie and other counter-revolutionary forces. For Lenin, the role of the state in the early years of socialism was to ensure that the revolution would survive and to lay the groundwork for the eventual establishment of a stateless, classless society. A key element of Lenin's theory of the state was his belief that the Communist Party should lead the revolution, guiding the workers and peasants in the transformation of society. While Marx had envisioned a spontaneous uprising of the working class, Lenin's experiences in Russia led him to believe that a disciplined, centralized party of professional revolutionaries was necessary to guide the working class through the complexities of revolution and the challenges of building socialism. The Vanguard Party was central to Lenin's understanding of how the state could function in a socialist society. The party would act as the leading force in the transition to socialism, while ensuring that the working class retained political power. For Lenin, the dictatorship of the proletariat was not an authoritarian imposition, but a revolutionary tool to dismantle the old capitalist state and set the stage for a new socialist society. Lenin did not envision the state as a permanent feature of socialist governance. Rather, it was a transitional necessity that would eventually be replaced by a system of self-governing communes and workers' councils, Soviets. The state, as he saw it, would be used to break down capitalist structures, redistribute wealth, and maintain the revolutionary order during the initial stages of the socialist experiment. However, as the years progressed, Lenin's view of the state and its role in the revolution became more complex. Faced with the challenges of maintaining power and governance in a newly established war-torn society, Lenin increasingly relied on centralized authority within the Bolshevik Party. The establishment of the Cheka, secret police, to suppress political opposition, the implementation of war communism, and the eventual introduction of the new economic policy, NEP, all highlighted the centralization of power in the hands of the state and the Communist Party. While Lenin continued to justify these measures as necessary to secure the revolution, the gap between his original ideals of a democratic, decentralized system of governance and the reality of centralized control became more pronounced. In the early years of the Soviet Union, the centralized state played a critical role in both stabilizing the economy and dealing with the external and internal threats the revolution faced. The Soviet government under Lenin's leadership quickly moved to nationalize industry, redistribute land to the peasantry, and centralize political authority. These moves were justified as necessary to ensure that the revolution could survive and to lay the foundation for a socialist economy. However, these actions also raised questions about the role of the state in the new society, and whether it could be reconciled with the democratic ideals Lenin had initially espoused. The question of whether the state could ever wither away remained an open issue during Lenin's lifetime. While Lenin had envisioned the state as a temporary institution, the realities of governing a socialist state in a hostile world made it increasingly difficult to imagine a future without state control. The Cheka, established to suppress counter-revolutionary activity, became a powerful tool of state control, and the Red Terror, which saw mass executions and imprisonment of perceived enemies of the revolution, raised concerns about the methods being employed to defend the revolution. Lenin's commitment to the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat led him to adopt authoritarian measures to ensure the survival of the revolution. The creation of a one-party state, the suppression of opposition parties, and the use of violence to eliminate perceived threats to the revolution were all justified as necessary actions to safeguard the revolution's goals. Lenin believed that the revolution could not afford to be lenient or idealistic in its early stages. The reality of power, in Lenin's view, required strict control and the use of the state to ensure the revolution's success. Despite his efforts to maintain a centralized state, Lenin also sought to create a society in which power would eventually rest in the hands of the workers themselves. The vision of a stateless, classless society remained central to Lenin's ultimate goals, but the path to achieving that goal became increasingly uncertain. The challenges of war, famine, economic collapse, and political opposition led Lenin to adopt increasingly authoritarian measures, which shaped the trajectory of the Soviet Union long after his death. Lenin's ideas on the state would have lasting consequences for the Soviet system. After his death in 1924, the question of the state's role in the Soviet Union became a focal point of ideological debate. Joseph Stalin would ultimately consolidate power, marking the beginning of a more centralized, bureaucratic and authoritarian phase of Soviet governance. Stalin's policies would move further away from Lenin's vision of a stateless, classless society, and instead, a highly centralized and repressive system would take shape. Nevertheless, Lenin's original ideas about the dictatorship of the proletariat and the role of the state in the transition to socialism continued to influence Soviet policies throughout the 20th century. Lenin's ideas, both in theory and in practice, became the cornerstone of Soviet ideology, guiding not only the policies of the Soviet Union, but also the development of the global communist movement. Leninism, the adaptation of Marxism he pioneered, became the defining political and ideological framework of the Soviet state for much of the 20th century. Even after his death, his ideas continued to resonate within the Soviet system, influencing the course of the country under Stalin and subsequent leaders. Yet the very legacy of Lenin's ideology was also shaped by the contradictions and tensions within his approach to revolution, governance, and the role of the state. At its core, Leninism was an adaptation of Marxist theory that emphasized the need for a vanguard party to lead the revolution in a country like Russia, where capitalism was not fully developed. Unlike Marx, who envisioned socialism emerging naturally from the contradictions of advanced capitalism, Lenin believed that the working class, even in an underdeveloped society, could rise to power through the leadership of a professional, disciplined party of revolutionaries. This was the foundational concept that would guide Soviet ideology. The party must be the leading force of the revolution, even if the conditions were not ideal for a spontaneous uprising. Lenin's interpretation of Marxism also extended to his view of the state and its role in socialism. Marx had envisioned a state that would wither away after the working class had seized power. Lenin, however, argued that the state would not immediately wither away, but would need to be wielded by the proletariat as a tool for suppressing the bourgeoisie and securing the revolution. The dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin's reworking of Marx's theory, became central to Soviet ideology. The state would play a role in repressing counter-revolutionary forces, while the Communist Party would guide the transformation of society towards socialism. Once the Bolsheviks seized power, Lenin's leadership and decisions reinforced these core elements of Soviet ideology. His policy of war communism, the nationalization of industry and land redistribution to the peasants, were all based on his interpretation of Marx's theories in the context of the Russian Revolution. Even when economic realities forced Lenin to adjust his policies, such as with the introduction of the New Economic Policy, NEP, he continued to justify the necessity of state power and centralized leadership in guiding the socialist project. These decisions were essential to the survival of the revolution in the face of internal strife and foreign intervention. Under Lenin, the Communist Party became not just a political entity, but the ideological and organizational backbone of the Soviet system. The idea of a centralized, disciplined party that would lead the revolution and serve as the vanguard of the proletariat became the guiding principle of Soviet governance. The Soviet Union, under Lenin's influence, would not be a society based on the immediate realization of a stateless, classless world. Instead, the Soviet Union was a one-party state where the Communist Party held a monopoly on political power, shaping every aspect of governance, the economy and society. While Lenin did not intend to create a totalitarian state, the mechanisms of power that he established, including the creation of the Cheka, secret police, the suppression of political dissent, and the use of violence to safeguard the revolution, led to the emergence of a system of governance that increasingly mirrored the authoritarian structures of the Tsarist regime he had sought to overthrow. The development of a centralized authoritarian state apparatus within the Bolshevik framework, although initially justified as temporary, laid the foundation for the future bureaucratic system of the Soviet Union. Lenin's approach to ideological purity and discipline was also central to the development of Soviet thought. He understood that the revolution required the strict control of ideas and the suppression of counter-revolutionary influences within the party. The rise of the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and other competing factions within the left was seen as a threat to the unity of the revolution. Lenin's policy of democratic centralism, which emphasized the need for a unified party leadership and centralized decision-making, became the cornerstone of Soviet political ideology. While it promised internal democracy, it often led to the silencing of dissenting voices within the party. The Red Terror, which emerged during the Russian Civil War, was a direct reflection of Lenin's belief that the survival of the revolution required the violent repression of its enemies. Despite the authoritarian nature of his rule, Lenin's ideology continued to influence the Soviet Union after his death, even as his original ideals were increasingly distorted under Joseph Stalin. Stalinism, with its focus on a cult of personality, totalitarian control, and the forced collectivization of agriculture, diverged significantly from Lenin's vision of socialism. However, Stalin's policies were justified through the lens of Leninism, with the Soviet leadership invoking Lenin's name and legacy to legitimize their actions. Lenin's image was used as a tool by successive Soviet leaders to maintain their authority and reinforce the idea that the Soviet state was the true heir to the Bolshevik Revolution. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union underwent a period of de-Stalinization led by Nikita Khrushchev, who sought to distance the Soviet system from Stalin's excesses. During this period, Lenin's image as the father of the revolution was re-emphasized, and his legacy was revisited and reassessed. Khrushchev's criticisms of Stalin's leadership, particularly regarding the cult of personality and the purges, were framed as a return to Lenin's principles of collective leadership and revolutionary democracy. Yet, even during this period, the core elements of Lenin's ideology, the central role of the Communist Party, the need for a controlled economy, and the dominance of the Vanguard Party, remained intact. Lenin's influence on Soviet ideology remained significant even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Following the dissolution of the Soviet state, there was a reconsideration of Lenin's role in Russian history, with some viewing him as the founder of a powerful socialist state, while others saw him as the architect of an authoritarian system that led to the repression of political freedoms and individual rights. Lenin's image was both revered and critiqued, with debates continuing about whether his revolutionary ideals were ever fully realized and whether his legacy should be viewed in light of the repressive state that followed. Lenin's ideological legacy, however, is not limited to the Soviet Union. His ideas about the role of the Vanguard Party, his theories on imperialism, and his emphasis on revolutionary action influenced socialist and communist movements worldwide. Leninism provided the ideological framework for a range of political movements in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and other countries that sought to overthrow imperialism and establish socialism. In the end, Lenin's influence on Soviet ideology and global revolutionary thought was both profound and paradoxical. His ideas laid the groundwork for the Soviet state and its policies, but the very system he helped create would, in many ways, depart from the democratic ideals he had espoused. Lenin's legacy is marked by both the achievements of the Russian Revolution and the contradictions of its aftermath. His vision for a just classless society was complicated by the realities of power, and his revolutionary tactics would evolve into the centralized authoritarian system that ultimately defined Soviet governance. Lenin's health, particularly in his later years, had a profound impact on both his personal life and the trajectory of the Soviet Union. While he was a figure of immense energy and intellectual vigor during the early stages of the Russian Revolution, his health began to decline rapidly after he assumed leadership of the Bolshevik Party. Lenin's ability to govern and exert influence was significantly hampered by illness, leading to complications that would shape both his leadership and the future direction of Soviet Russia. Lenin's first major health crisis occurred in May 1922, when he suffered a severe stroke. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, affecting his ability to speak and write. Though he was still mentally sharp and continued to work in some capacity, his physical condition had clearly deteriorated. As a result, Lenin was forced to retreat from the day-to-day operations of the government and delegate authority to other members of the Bolshevik leadership. However, his illness also coincided with a period of intense political struggle within the Communist Party, and his absence from the political stage allowed power struggles to intensify. The stroke marked a turning point in Lenin's leadership. While he'd always been the dominant figure in Soviet politics, the increasing frequency of his health issues meant that he could no longer maintain the same level of control over the Soviet government. The party's leadership, including figures like Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, and Lev Kamenev, began to assert more power in Lenin's absence. Despite this, Lenin's influence remained significant, and his thoughts on the future of the revolution were sought after by those in power. However, by the time of his second stroke in December 1922, Lenin had become increasingly incapacitated, Lenin's health issues had a particularly profound impact on his relationship with Joseph Stalin. Stalin, who had been one of Lenin's closest allies during the revolution, began to consolidate his power during Lenin's period of illness. Lenin's distrust of Stalin grew as Stalin's rise to power became more pronounced. In his final writings, particularly his testament, Lenin expressed his concerns about Stalin's authoritarian tendencies and the potential dangers of his leadership. Lenin criticized Stalin's lack of personal tact and his ruthless treatment of party members. In his testament, Lenin recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that gave Stalin immense power over party appointments. Unfortunately, Lenin's health was too frail for him to directly address these concerns, and his testament was largely ignored by the party leadership. Stalin's consolidation of power in the years following Lenin's death marked a dramatic shift in Soviet politics. Stalin's ability to navigate the political landscape, including neutralizing rivals like Trotsky, allowed him to assume leadership of the Soviet Union after Lenin's passing. While Lenin's political influence remained, the power vacuum created by his health issues made it easier for Stalin and others to assert their dominance. Lenin's incapacitation ultimately led to the rise of an authoritarian system in the Soviet Union, one that would later be characterized by Stalin's personality cult and the purges that defined the later years of Soviet history. Lenin's health decline also had a profound effect on his ideological legacy. While Lenin's earlier work had focused on revolutionary theory, political strategy, and the mechanics of governance, his later years were increasingly marked by reflection on the direction of the Soviet state and its future. In his last writings, Lenin expressed concerns about the growing bureaucratization of the state and the rise of a centralized party elite. He was deeply aware of the contradictions between the revolutionary ideals he had espoused and the reality of governing a socialist state. Lenin's decline also coincided with the growing tensions within the Bolshevik Party. While he had always emphasized the importance of unity and collective leadership, the power struggles that occurred in his absence highlighted the challenges of maintaining this unity in the face of competing personal ambitions. Lenin's health issues forced him to retreat from active leadership, just as the political and ideological divides within the party began to widen. These tensions would culminate in the Stalinist period, when the party's unity was effectively shattered and internal dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. The impact of Lenin's health on his leadership was not solely political, it also had a personal dimension. Lenin was deeply frustrated by his inability to engage with the revolution he had helped lead. He had been a tireless advocate for the Bolshevik cause, but his illness left him unable to participate fully in the political and intellectual life of the Soviet Union. In his final years, Lenin's health issues became a source of personal anguish. He had once been the visionary and driving force behind the Russian Revolution, but now he found himself sidelined by his own body. This sense of personal defeat was compounded by his growing concern about the future of the revolution and the direction in which it was heading. The influence of Lenin's declining health extended beyond the political realm. His personal relationship with key Bolshevik figures, such as his wife Nadezhda Krupskaya, and his allies within the party was also affected. Krupskaya, who had been a lifelong supporter of Lenin, became a key figure in managing his health and advocating for his wishes within the party. Despite his physical decline, Lenin remained intellectually active, dictating notes and providing guidance to those around him. But his ability to lead the country and shape events was increasingly limited. Lenin's health issues and eventual death in 1924 brought a definitive end to an era in Soviet history. His death left the Soviet Union in a precarious position, with the leadership unsure of how to continue the work he had started. The power struggles that followed Lenin's death ultimately led to Stalin's rise and the establishment of an increasingly repressive regime. While Lenin had envisioned a system of collective leadership and democratic centralism, Stalin's authoritarian rule would depart from many of these ideals, ushering in a period of terror and purges that contrasted sharply with Lenin's early revolutionary goals. However, Lenin's ideas and leadership remained central to the Soviet Union's identity long after his death. His image was maintained as the symbol of the revolution, and his theoretical contributions continued to influence Soviet policies and global communist movements. Lenin's vision for the revolution, his contributions to Marxist thought, and his role in the creation of the Soviet state left a legacy that would be debated, revered, and contested for decades. Vladimir Lenin's contributions to world history cannot be understated. His revolutionary actions and political theories played a pivotal role in shaping the course of the 20th century. Lenin not only transformed Russia, but also helped shape the global socialist movement, laying the groundwork for numerous revolutionary movements across the world. His legacy is both monumental and controversial, with some viewing him as a visionary leader who fought for equality and social justice, while others criticize him for laying the foundations of an authoritarian regime that would eventually stifle the very ideals he espoused. The most direct and enduring impact of Lenin's leadership was the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922. After decades of autocratic rule under the Tsar, Russia became the world's first socialist state. Lenin's role in this transformation was fundamental. He led the Bolshevik Party in the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and guided the Russian Revolution of 1917. Under his leadership, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, was created, which would later form the basis of the Soviet Union. This was a momentous shift in world history, as the Russian Revolution proved that it was possible to overthrow an entrenched autocratic regime and replace it with a socialist government. Lenin's influence extended far beyond Russia. His interpretation of Marxism, known as Leninism, became the guiding ideology for revolutionary movements across the world. Lenin adapted Marxist theory to the specific conditions of Russia, arguing that revolution could take place even in a country that was not fully industrialized. His focus on the Vanguard Party, a disciplined, centralized group of professional revolutionaries, and his belief in the necessity of a dictatorship of the proletariat during the transition to socialism became core elements of Leninist theory. These ideas influenced socialist movements in countries such as China, Vietnam, Cuba, and many others, shaping the course of revolutionary activity throughout the 20th century. The establishment of the Comintern, Communist International, in 1919 under Lenin's direction was another key element of his legacy. The Comintern aimed to promote global revolution and unite communist parties worldwide. Though the organization would face many challenges and contradictions in the years to come, it was instrumental in fostering international solidarity among socialist and communist movements. Lenin saw the Russian Revolution as part of a broader international struggle to overthrow capitalism and imperialism, and the Comintern was his vehicle for advancing this cause. However, despite Lenin's attempts to spread revolution internationally, the immediate impact of his ideas was limited. The failure of revolutions in Western Europe, particularly in Germany and Hungary, meant that the Russian Revolution stood alone for much of the early 20th century. Lenin's hope for a world revolution was not realized in his lifetime, and the Soviet Union as a socialist state remained isolated from the capitalist powers. Nevertheless, Lenin's leadership and the success of the Bolsheviks in securing power provided a model for later movements, particularly in the decolonizing world, where national liberation struggles were often linked to socialist ideals. Lenin's contributions to revolutionary theory were profound, but his leadership also laid the groundwork for the authoritarian Soviet system that would come to define the USSR. While he envisioned a democratic socialist society, his actions and decisions often conflicted with this ideal. Lenin believed that the working class should control the means of production and that the state should represent their interests. But in practice, the Bolshevik government became highly centralized, with power concentrated in the hands of the Communist Party. The state bureaucracy grew, and political opposition was suppressed. Lenin justified these actions as necessary to safeguard the revolution from both internal and external threats, but they also set the stage for the totalitarianism that would characterize Soviet rule, particularly under Joseph Stalin. Lenin's legacy, therefore, is one of contradictions. He was a revolutionary who sought to dismantle oppression and create a new egalitarian society, but the methods he employed, including the use of violence, state repression, and centralized control, contradicted the very ideals he fought for. The Red Terror, the suppression of political dissent, and the rise of a powerful bureaucratic state were in stark contrast to Lenin's early calls for a classless, stateless society. These contradictions would only deepen after his death, as Stalin's regime took the Soviet Union in a direction that diverged from Lenin's vision of collective leadership and democratic socialism. Despite these contradictions, Lenin's impact on the world cannot be denied. His leadership inspired socialist and communist movements around the globe, particularly in countries under imperialist or colonial rule. Lenin's ideas about anti-imperialism and the connection between national liberation and socialism were influential in China, Vietnam, Cuba, and many other countries where revolutionary movements sought to challenge colonial domination. His belief that socialism could be achieved even in less industrialized countries provided hope to millions living under colonial rule. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, adapted Lenin's ideas to China's rural conditions, ultimately leading to the success of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Similarly, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Fidel Castro in Cuba were deeply influenced by Lenin's thought in their struggles against imperialism and colonialism. Lenin's influence also extended to the ideological development of the Cold War and the division of the world into capitalist and communist blocs. The Soviet Union, under Lenin and his successors, became the principal challenger to Western capitalism, and Lenin's ideas about imperialism, class struggle, and revolution provided the ideological justification for Soviet foreign policy and military interventions. The legacy of the Russian Revolution, shaped by Lenin's vision, would resonate throughout the 20th century, with communist parties around the world drawing on Leninist principles to justify their actions. In Russia itself, Lenin's legacy has been a subject of intense debate. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was a reconsideration of Lenin's role in Russian history. Some saw him as the founding father of the Soviet state, a leader who achieved extraordinary social and political change. Others viewed him as the architect of an oppressive system that led to authoritarianism and the suppression of basic freedoms. The removal of Lenin's statues in post-Soviet Russia symbolized the rejection of the Soviet past, but Lenin's image remains a powerful symbol in the country's political discourse. Ultimately, Lenin's legacy is one of profound transformation, a legacy that reshaped the course of Russian and world history. While the Soviet system he helped create became one of the most powerful and enduring political entities of the 20th century, it also became a symbol of the contradictions inherent in revolutionary ideals. Lenin's ideas continued to shape political thought and revolutionary movements, even as his legacy is debated and contested. The Russian Revolution of 1917, led by Lenin, remains a pivotal moment in history, one that forever altered the political landscape of the world and continues to resonate with struggles for justice, equality, and social change. Vladimir Lenin's life and work have left an indelible mark on the course of world history. From his role in leading the Russian Revolution and establishing the Soviet Union, to his ideas that would shape socialist movements across the globe, Lenin's legacy remains a powerful and contested force. His vision of a socialist world driven by the working class and guided by a disciplined vanguard party transformed not only Russia, but also the broader political landscape of the 20th century. Lenin was both a visionary and a pragmatist. He saw the potential for a better world, free from the chains of capitalism and imperialism, but he also understood the harsh realities of revolution and governance. His leadership during the revolution was marked by determination, strategic insight, and an unwavering commitment to the cause of socialism. Yet, as the realities of power took hold, Lenin's ideals were often in tension with the methods he used to consolidate power and safeguard the revolution. These contradictions are part of what makes Lenin such a complex and fascinating figure in history. The Soviet system Lenin helped create would evolve in ways that he could not have predicted. While he had hoped for a world revolution, the Soviet Union remained isolated for much of its early years, forcing the leadership to focus on consolidating power within its borders. Lenin's ideas about the role of the state, the necessity of a strong party, and the dictatorship of the proletariat became the foundations of the Soviet state, but they also laid the groundwork for the authoritarianism that would later characterize the Soviet system, especially under Stalin. Despite these contradictions, Lenin's contribution to global revolutionary thought remains undeniable. Lenin's influence extends far beyond the borders of Russia. His ideas inspired revolutionary movements in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and many other parts of the world. His vision of a world free from imperialism and exploitation resonated with colonized nations and marginalized peoples everywhere. Though Lenin's vision was not fully realized in his lifetime, it provided a foundation for the struggles that followed and continues to inspire those who seek justice and equality in the modern world. As we reflect on Lenin's life, it is clear that his legacy is not one of simple triumph or failure. It is a legacy of transformation, of a world radically changed by the forces of revolution. Lenin's life was a testament to the power of ideas and the profound impact that leadership can have on history. Whether viewed as a hero or a flawed revolutionary, Lenin's place in history is secure, and his influence remains an enduring force in the ongoing struggle for a better world. In the end, Lenin's legacy is one of constant re-examination. His contributions to the revolution, his ideological evolution, and the reality of the Soviet state he helped create continue to spark debate and reflection. Lenin's life reminds us of the complexities of revolution, the limits of power, and the challenges of building a just society. As we look back on his life and work, we are reminded of the powerful forces that shape history and the enduring struggle for a more equitable world.